Chapter 51. The 30s were zombie years. Civilization had been killed, but it kept walking the earth, staggering toward some fate even worse than death. Everyone felt it. The culture of the time was rife with fear and anger, denial and guilt, shame and regret, repression and the return of the repressed. They went through the motions, always in a state of suspended dread, always aware of their wounded status, wondering what massive stroke would fall next and how they would manage to ignore that one too, when it was already such a huge effort to ignore the ones that had happened so far, a string of them going all the way back to 2020. Certainly the Indian heat wave stayed a big part of it. They could neither face it nor forget it. They couldn't think about it, but they couldn't not think about it, not without a huge subconscious effort. The images. The sheer numbers. These were called the Holocaust, which had left a huge hole in civilization's sense of itself. That was 6 million people, but an old story, and of Jewish people killed by Germans. It was a German thing. The Palestinians' Nakba, the partition of India, on and on these bad stories went, the numbers always unimaginable, but always before it had been certain groups of people who were responsible, people from an earlier, more barbaric time, or so they told themselves. And always these thoughts obtruded in an attempt to stave off the heat wave, which was now said to have killed 20 million. As many people, in other words, as soldiers had died in World War I, a death toll which had taken 4 years of intensely purposeful killing, and the heat wave had taken only 2 weeks. It somewhat resembled the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, they said, but not. Not a pathogen, not genocide, not a war, simply human action and inaction, their own action and inaction, killing the most vulnerable. And more would surely follow, because they all were vulnerable in the end. And yet still they burned carbon. They drove cars, ate meat, flew in jets, did all the things that had caused the heat wave and would cause the next one. Profits still were added up in a way that led to shareholder dividends. And so on. Everyone alive knew that not enough was being done, and everyone kept doing too little. Repression, of course, followed. It was all too Freudian, but Freud's model for the mind was the steam engine, meaning containment, pressure, and release. Repression thus built up internal pressure, then the return of the repressed was a release of that pressure. It could be vented or it could simply blow up the engine. How? Then people in the 30s. A hiss or a bang. The whistle of vented pressure doing useful work, as in some functioning engine? Or boom. No one could say, and so they staggered on day to day, and the pressure kept building. So it was not really a surprise when a day came that 60 passenger jets crashed in a matter of hours. All over the world, flights of all kinds, although when the analyses were done it became clear that a disproportionate number of these flights had been private or business jets, and the commercial flights that had gone down had been mostly occupied by business travelers. But people, innocent people, flying for all kinds of reasons, all dead. About 7,000 people died that day, ordinary civilians going about their lives. Later it was shown that clouds of small drones had been directed into the flight paths of the planes involved, fouling their engines. The drones had mostly been destroyed, and their manufacturers and flyers have never been conclusively tracked. Quite a few terrorist groups took credit for the action in the immediate aftermath and demanded various things, but it has never been clear that any of them really had anything to do with it. That multiple groups would claim responsibility for such a crime just added to the horror felt at the time. What kind of world were they in? One message was fairly obvious: stop flying. And indeed many people stopped. Before that day, there had been 500,000 people in the air at any given moment. Afterward, that number plummeted. Especially after a second round of crashes occurred a month later, this time bringing down 20 planes. After that, commercial flights often flew empty, then were cancelled. Private jets had stopped flying. Military planes and helicopters had also been attacked, so they too curtailed their activities and flew only if needed, as if in a war. As indeed they were. It was noticed that none of the experimental battery-powered planes had been brought down and no biofuel-powered planes, also no blimps, dirigibles, or hot air balloons. No airships of any kind. But in that period there were so few of these, it was hard to tell at the time if they had been given a pass or not. It looked like they had, it seemed to make sense, and the surge in airship manufacture, which had already gotten a small start, has never ceased to this day. The war for the Earth is often said to have begun on Crash Day. And it was later that same year when container ships began to sink, almost always close to land. Torpedoes from nowhere. A different kind of drone. It was noticed early on in this campaign that ships often went down where they could form the foundations for new coral reefs. In any case, they were going down. They ran on diesel fuel, of course. Loss of life in these sinkings was minimal, but world trade was severely impacted. Stock markets fell even lower than they had after Crash Day. A worldwide recession, a feeling of loss of control, price spikes in consumer goods, the clear prospect of the full-blown depression that indeed followed a few years later. It was a time of dread. 2 months after Crash Day, a group called Cali, or the Children of Cali, issued a manifesto over the internet. No more fossil fuel burning transport. That was about 20 to 25% of civilization's total carbon burn at this point, and all of it vulnerable to disruption, as the manifesto put it. Next up, the Children of Cali, or someone using that name, told the world, cows. Later that same year, the group announced that mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, had been cultured and introduced by drone dart into millions of cattle all over the world. Everywhere but in India, but especially in the United States and Brazil and England and Canada. Nothing could stop these cattle from sickening and dying in a few years, and if eaten, their disease could migrate into human brains, where it manifested as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and was invariably fatal. So to stay safe, people needed to stop eating beef now. And indeed in the 40s and ever after, less beef got eaten. Less milk was drunk, and fewer jet flights were made. Of course, many people were quick to point out that these Children of Cali were hypocrites and monsters, that Indians didn't eat cows and so didn't feel that loss, that coal-fired power plants in India had burned a significant portion of the last decade's carbon burn, and so on. Then again, those same Indian power plants were being attacked on a regular basis, so it wasn't clear who was doing what to whom. Scores of power plants were being destroyed all over the world, often by drone attacks. Power outages in those years were most common in India, but they happened everywhere else too. The war for the Earth was real, but the aggressors were nowhere to be found. It was often asserted they were not in India at all, and were not even an Indian organization, but rather an international movement. Cali was nowhere, Cali was everywhere. Chapter 52. Our Sikkim became a state with fully organic agriculture between 2003 and 2016, aided by the scholar-philosopher feminist permaculturist Vandana Shiva, an important figure for many of us in India. Of course, Sikkim is the least populated Indian state, with less than 1 million people, and the third smallest in economic terms. But it grows more cardamom than any place but Guatemala, and one of its names is Baol Demazong, the hidden valley of rice, Baols being sacred hidden valleys in Buddhist lore, including Shambhala and Kembalum. Sikkim is precisely this kind of magical place, and its version of organic agriculture, one aspect of permaculture generally, became of interest across India in mid-century, as part of the renewal and the new India, and the making of a better world. Here again, Vandana Shiva was an important leading public intellectual, combining defense of local land rights, indigenous knowledge, feminism, post-caste Hinduism, and other progressive programs characteristic of New India and the renewal. Important also has been the example of Kerala, at the opposite end of India, for its crucial innovations in local government. A state blessed by location on the southwest coast of India, with a long history of interactions with Africa and Europe, home to fabled Trivandrum, Kerala has long been governed by a power-sharing agreement between the Left Democratic Front, which was very influenced by the Indian Communist Party, and the Old Congress Party, which, though out of favor at the national level, always kept a fairly substantial level of support in Kerala, as representing the Party of Independence and Gandhi's Satyagraha, meaning peace force. The LDF has been the dominant party in Kerala since Indian independence a century ago, and one of the main projects for the party has always been devolution to local governance, closing in on the goal of what one might call direct democracy. In Kerala now there are panchayats for every village, then district governments that coordinate these panchayats and oversee disputes and care for any necessary business at the district levels, and above them is the state government in Tiruvananthapuram, looking after such business as involves the whole state together. The focus on local government has been so intense and diligent that there now total 1,200 governmental bodies in Kerala, all dealing with issues in their particular area, whatever it might be. Strangely, perhaps, or perhaps it is not so strange, it is often said of both Sikkim and Kerala that they are exceptionally beautiful places and both attract more tourists than most Indian states. But in truth, almost every Indian state is beautiful, if you take the trouble to visit it and look. It is a very beautiful country. So the answer to the success of these two states cannot be put down entirely to the beauty of their landscapes. Although treated very poorly for a long time by various invading interests, including the Mughals, the Rajas, the British, globalization, and corrupt national governments from every party, but especially from the Congress Party in its waning days of power, and then the Hindu triumphalist BJP party, both now disgraced for their connections to the heat wave, India continues to rise above all and do its best. So in the new India, in the time since the heat wave, there was a complete revamping of priorities, and if at all possible the introduction of India-based solutions to the problems afflicting us. Here Sikkim and Kerala are in their different ways great exemplars of what can be done by good governance and India-first values and practices. Of course, the solutions to our ills can't come entirely from within India's borders, big though it is compared to many countries, both geographically and in terms of population. No matter how big, all countries now need the whole world to be behaving well. Still, India is big and big enough to provide human, agricultural, and mineral resources for a great deal of rapid upgradation. What has been of interest is to see if the advances pioneered in the states could be rapidly scaled to the whole country. Not just Kerala and Sikkim, of course, but also states like Bangalore, the so-called Silicon Valley of India, which has led the way in that regard by founding a great number of engineering colleges. Now Bangalore, the Garden City, third largest in India, is thriving as a global hub for IT and innovations there in the creation of the so-called Internet of Land and Animals might well help the process of full modernization of the Indian countryside. And then, of course, there is Bollywood in Mumbai and the enormous mineral resources all up and down the spine of the country. Even taking coal off the table, as we have, the sheer physical wealth of India is unsurpassed, and in a world powered by solar power, India is indeed blessed. More sunlight energy falls on India than on any other nation on earth. So the important thing now is to join up past and future together and join up also all the diversity of people and landscapes that is India into a single integrated project. The biggest democracy on earth has huge problems still and also huge potential for solutions. We need to learn our agriculture from Sikkim, governance from Kerala, IT from Bangalore, and so on and so forth. Each state has its contribution, and we must then put them all together to work for everyone in our country. When we have done that, then we will provide an example for the world that it needs. And also, having solved the contemporary problems of life in a democratic fashion for 1/7 of all humanity, there are that many fewer people for the rest of the world to worry about. Chapter 53. I zing and I ping and I bring and I bling. Free to self in the heart of the sun, I banged around in there for 1,000,000 years before popping out the surface and zipping off. Then 8 minutes to Earth. In the vacuum I move at the speed of light. Indeed, I define the speed of light by my dance. Into Earth's atmosphere, exhibiting aspects both wave and particle but not either, I am a force space conceptualized as an hourglass shape in 3 space, where time and space cross in the human mind. Hitting things again, slowing down, breaking off brothers and sisters trapped in things, all the same, all without mass, all spin one, and so bosons, not fermions. One 360-degree turn and I'm back where I began in that regard, while for fermions it takes 720 degrees of turning to get back to its original position. Fermions are strange. I am not strange, I am simple. Banging into atoms and moving them as I too move, simple as Newton, bang bang bang. The atoms of the atmosphere move more than they would have without my kick in their pants. That's heat. Until I kick into something that captures me and I stop moving on my own. That, or I might bounce off something I hit and head back out into space, become the light in the eye of some lunatic observer, looking up at the big blue ball and seeing me bang something in their retina. A blue pixel of the utmost granular fineness, so much so that the wave I make is easier to detect, maybe even easier to imagine. The wave/particle duality is a real thing, and both at once is hard to think, hard to see. It doesn't really work. Force space in your 3-space mind, no. I am a mysterious thing, massless but powerful. There are more of us than there are of anything else. Well, perhaps that's not true. We don't know about dark matter, which should be called invisible matter. We don't know them or what's going on there. Presumably its individual constituent elements are something like me, but maybe not. No one knows. All that stuff flies around as if in a parallel universe slightly overlapping ours, maybe just waves. In any case, gravity works on it for sure, because its very existence has been revealed to us by its gravitation effects. If we are similar to those dark matterinos, it is in the way that light and dark are similar. 2 parts of a whole, perhaps. I am visible. I embody light itself. Dark matter is not actually dark. It is invisible, and we don't know how or what it is. Our absent self, our shadow, our twin. Although there are a lot more of them than us, maybe. A mystery among all the other mysteries. We fly through each other like ghosts. But me, banging Earth, bouncing back up into the eye of an observer on the moon, then off again, immortal, immutable. I bang bluely on and on and on, and in the process, passing by just this once in a cloud of my brothers and sisters, we hit Earth and light it up, and the gas wrapping the planet's hydrosphere and lithosphere gets warmer from our touch. My brothers and sisters follow me, and they continue that warming. What am I? You must have guessed already. I am a photon. Chapter 54. Mary hunkered down in the wan light of winter Zurich, meeting daily with her team to plot their next moves. The whole baker's dozen gathered in the mornings to share the news and plan the day, the week, the decade. It was like a war room now, yes, and their work felt like war work. Not war, however. There was no opponent, or if there was, it consisted of fellow citizens with a lot of money and or passion. If it was war, they were outgunned and on the defensive, but really it was mostly just discursive struggle, a war of words and ideas and laws, which only had brutal death-dealing consequences as a derivative effect that could be denied by aggressors on both sides. It was a civil war, perhaps a body politic punching itself over and over. In any case, war or not, It had that same besieged, awful feeling of existential danger, of stark emergency that never went away. The large number of people living rough in Zurich, busking for change, looking for work, or worse, not looking for work, that never got ordinary. It was not a Zuri thing. Nevertheless, Mary's life settled into a routine that was, she had to admit, almost pleasant. Or at least absorbing. Busy. Possibly productive. There were worse things than having a project in hand that felt crucial. She stayed in Zurich. When its winter gloom got to be too much for her, she took a Sunday train up to one of the nearby Alpine towns, popping up through the low cloud layer that banked on the north side of the Alps and made winter life in Zurich so sunless and gloomy. There had been 8 hours of sunlight in the first 50 days of this year, they told her, scattered over several days. It was like them to quantify a thing like that. But on a Sunday, she would take a break and train up into brilliant snowy light. The ski resorts were too crowded, and Mary was not a skier. But there were many alpine towns that had no skiing to speak of, being surrounded by sheer cliffs. Engelberg, Kandersteg, Adelboden, some others. In these towns, she could walk on cleared snow trails, or snowshoe them, or just sit on a terrace, soaking in the chill, brilliant light, the small crystalline sun in its big white sky. Then back down into the gloom. In Zurich, she met with her team and with outside helpers and antagonists. The fossil fuels industry's lawyers were getting more and more interested to learn how much they could extort from the system if they chose to sequester their asset. This was by no means a trivial topic. Indeed, it was a crucial matter, and Mary entered into it with great interest. To a certain extent, it felt to her like she was negotiating to buy off terrorists who had explosive vests strapped around their waists and were saying to her and to the world at large, "Pay us or we blow up the world." But this was not exactly right. First, if no one would buy their product, their explosives wouldn't go off and they couldn't blow up the world. So their threat was hollowing by the day, which explained why they were talking to her at all. Their leverage as terrorists, with the biosphere as their hostage, was lessening. And as the Ministry for the Future was one place where they might be able to negotiate a settlement, they were coming to Zurich to bargain. Then also, they were not terrorists. It was an analogy, maybe a bad one, or at least a partial one. Civilization needed electricity, and it was citizens who had powered themselves on these fossil fuels for the last couple of centuries. The owners of these fuels were sometimes private individuals who had gotten fantastically rich, but many times they were nation-states that had claimed ownership of the fuels found within their boundaries as assets of the state and its citizenry. These petrostates controlled about 3/4 of the fossil fuels that had to stay in the ground, and they too were seeking compensation for the losses they would incur by not selling and burning their fuels. So it was a mixed bag in that respect. ExxonMobil was big, yes, and held more in assets than many nations in the world, but China, Russia, Australia, the Arab states, Venezuela, Canada, Mexico, the US, these were bigger in carbon assets than ExxonMobil and the other private companies. And they all wanted compensation, even though all of them had agreed in the Paris Agreement to decarbonize. Pay us for not ruining the world. It was extortion, a protection racket squeezing its victims. But the victims were the national populations, so in effect they were putting the squeeze on themselves. Or their elected politicians were putting the squeeze on them. So the situation was bizarre, both hard to define and constantly changing. So meetings kept happening. Mary kept on pushing the idea of creating the money to pay for decarbonization and all the necessary mitigation work. As the weeks passed and the global economy went from recession to depression, Dick almost convinced her that taxation might be a good enough tool to do the job all by itself. What counted, he said, was differentials in cost and benefit. So in that sense, meaning in effect the bottom line in accounting books, taxes were both stick and carrot. On the bottom line, Whether a person's or a company's or a nation's, there was no difference between stick and carrot. They were both incentives. And if nations levied taxes, they got the money themselves. Rather than having their central banks print new money, they took in rather than shelled out. So if you did something that was stiffly taxed and progressively taxed the more you did it, that tax was a stick to beat you away from that activity. Then, if you didn't do that activity, you thereby dodged the tax and didn't have to pay it, and your bottom line showed that lack of payment as a plus in the ledger. So, avoiding the action that got taxed created a carrot. Mary saw Dick's point, but at the end of every discussion, didn't actually agree with him. Maybe it was just psychological rather than economic, but people liked to be paid for doing things more than they liked avoiding having to pay for something. There was a mental difference between carrots and sticks, no matter if the numbers were the same in a ledger. With the one you got fed, with the other you got hit. They simply were not the same. She would make this point to Dick over and over, and he would respond with his crazy economist smile, his acknowledgement of economics' fundamentally alien nature, the way it was a view from Mars, or a helpful but clueless AI, which last was more or less the case. Also, in terms of making a carrot, the oil industry had equipment and an expertise that could be adapted from pumping oil to pumping water. And pumping water was much easier. This was good, because if they were going to try to pump some of the ocean's water up onto Antarctica, the pumping effort was going to be prodigious. Even if they confined their efforts to draining the water from under the big glaciers, a lot of pumps would be needed. So the oil industry needed to stop pumping oil, for the most part, but they could be hired to pump water, or to pump captured carbon dioxide down into their emptied oil wells. Direct air capture of atmospheric CO2 was looking more and more like an important part of the overall solution, but if it scaled up to the size of the problem, it was going to produce an enormous amount of dry ice, which had to go somewhere. Pumping it underground was the obvious storage location. In some ways, these reverse pumping actions were easier and cheaper than pumping up oil. In other ways, they were a bit harder and more expensive. But in any case, they made use of an already existing technology, which was very extensive and powerful. If the industry could be paid to do something with its tech to help in the current situation, all the better. The fossil fuel lawyers and executives looked interested when this was proposed to them. The privately owned companies saw a chance of escaping with a viable post-oil business. The state-owned companies looked interested at the idea of compensation for their stranded assets, which they had already borrowed against, in the usual way of the rampant reckless financialization, which was the hallmark of their time. Paid to pump water from the ocean up to some catchment basin? Paid to pump CO2 into the ground? Paid how much? And who would front the startup expenses? You will, Mary told them. And why? When we don't have it. Because we'll sue you if you don't. And you do have it. You can pay the upfront costs of the transition, and if you invest in that, we'll pay you in a guaranteed currency that is backed by all the central banks of the world to increase in value over time. As an aspect written into the currency itself. A sure bet no matter what happens. Unless civilization crashes. Yes. You can short civilization if you want. Not a bad bet really. But no one to pay you if you win. Whereas if you go long on civilization, and civilization, therefore, survives, you win big. So the smart move is to go long. Go long. She found herself saying that a lot. Bob Wharton called it the Hail Mary Pass. It was a little strange to be saying, go long, to middle-aged men, so sleek and smooth in their wealth, sexually satisfied, said their aura, such that saying to them, go long, might be enough to trigger what she had once heard described as a hard-on in the heart. Well, if she was enticing them to expand confidently into the world, to make an intervention into the body of Great Mother Gaia, so huge and vivid and dangerous, then fine. So what? Mary had no illusions that she herself, a harried middle-aged female bureaucrat in a limp, toothless international organization, represented for these men any kind of stand-in for the Earth Mother, but she was a woman, perhaps even the fine remains of a woman, as the pirates of Penzance had said about Ruth, so hard of hearing. She could push that a little, and she did. Little sadistic lashings of what was really just Irish contempt for any form of pretense, of which there was a lot in these meetings. These men were often quite disgusting, in other words, but there was a higher purpose to be pursued. Then one day Janice Athena came into her office. This person was the opposite of all that bankerly masculine erotic charge. The project for JA was to efface gender, to exist in that very narrow in-between, the zone of actual gender unknowability, which itself was a new gender, presumably. Mary wouldn't even have believed that zone existed if it weren't for Janice Athena standing before her every day, completely unknowable in that aspect of self. Or to put it better, neither masculine nor feminine as any kind of dominant. This could only be the result of an extensive and canny effort. Mary regarded her mysterious AI expert with her usual curiosity. She wanted to say, J.A., what gender were you assigned at birth, if any? But this would be to break the social rules which either J.A. or Mary, or society at large, had imposed on her. It would be to intrude or to interfere with J.A.'s project. Probably J.A. got asked this pretty often, one way or another, but Mary wasn't going to. Acceptance of the other and their project. This was crucial. What have you got for me, Janice Athena? The AI group is making open source instruments that mimic the functions of all the big social media sites. So people can shift over to this new set? Yes. And it will protect their data for them using quantum encryption. Then China probably won't let their people use them. Maybe not. China is under huge pressure to change, so unclear how that will play out. For everyone else, using these sites means they'll control their data, rather than it being used and mined. That privacy can then be a resource to them. They can sell their personal data if they want. That plus the security of encryption and the public ownership of these sites as a commons should be enough to entice every user on the planet to shift. Publicize it, make it easy, set a date, be ready to handle the influx, boom. How many do you think will shift? Maybe half. After a few years, everybody. So, the decapitation of Facebook, and all the rest like it, replaced by a system owned by its users, in effect. Yes. Open source. A distributed ledger. The Global Internet Cooperative Union. G2. Is that a good name? Is Facebook a good name? Better than Jiku. Okay, think of a better one. Then if it works, it will serve as the operating platform for ICU. Which means, Mary prompted, playing along. International Credit Union. A people's bank. The team has set that up too. Lots of bank mirroring and credit unions are already a thing. This won't be quite like a credit union, because it would be an open network of people who make a distributed issuance of credit, issuing carbon coin fractions to each other on proof of good action on carbon. People deposit their savings and create new value in a customer and employee-owned distributed ledger. Their bank, as one function of their Yearlock account. It invests mindfully as a group mind, a kind of planetary mind, that has to always be funding biosphere-friendly activities. Also, a place to go if everyone removes their deposits from current private banks at the same time. Those banks are so over-leveraged that they will immediately crash. Then individuals have to have a safe harbor. For-profit banks will go running to central banks to ask for bailout, and legislatures will panic and agree to let central banks create however many trillions the central banks recommend. That's been the template so far. So, for any planned attack on private banks, best to have a safe harbor ready. Then you can tell the legislatures to approve central banks' bailout QE, but only on condition of buying equity in them. Nationalizing the banks, you mean? Yes, but that puts it too simply. Central banks take possession of private banks, having saved them from bankruptcy or death. Good as far as it goes, but legislatures also need to take possession of their own central banks by increasing political control of them. It's a double action. You need both. Will it work? Is it working now? Mary sighed. Point taken. Can you get the future into the name somehow? Since we're the Ministry for the Future. The internet interface name could be, I don't know, Children Own Your Data. COID. That's terrible. Some people are not good at names. I've noticed. As for instance, the names Janice and Athena had nothing to do with each other. But that was neither here nor there. Let's make the name a game. Get the whole gang down to a dinner at Trace Kilos and see what they come up with. As long as you're picking up the tab. Pictures there are ridiculously expensive. Right. And so, what about these projects? Oh yes, Mary said. Let's try it. Something has to be done. We're still losing. That night at Trace Kilos, over dinner and a couple pictures, they came up with some ideas for names for the Facebook replacement, which Mary scrawled down on her napkin. Data fort, e pluribus unum, we don't chat, only connect, a secure and lucrative one-stop replacement for your many stupid social media pages. Total encryption, Fortress Family, Family Fortress, Householders Union, Skynet, Spacehook. Weirith world weirith people, porcoipa, get paid to waste time. Maybe we're still looking, Mary concluded as she read the list on her napkin. Although I do kind of like we don't chat. Chapter 55. La vie vite. It was a time. The Gilets Jaunes shifted the model for how to proceed, away from May 68 or any fainter impressions of the Commune or 1848, not to mention 1793, which it has to be admitted is now like a vision from ancient history, despite the evident satisfactions of the guillotine for dealing with all the climate criminals sneaking off to their island fortress mansions. No, modern times. We had to get out into the streets day after day, week after week, and talk to ordinary people in their cars stuck in traffic, or walking past us on the sidewalks and metro platforms. We had to do that work like any other kind of work. It wasn't a party, it wasn't even a revolution. At least when we started. But soon we saw that people wanted to talk to us. They all knew they were being used, that they were just tools now. I myself was a kid. The main thing that got me out there was how much I hated school, where I had always been made to feel stupid. I was slotted into the bottom classes early on and my life was sealed at that point, on a track to servitude, even though I knew I had real thoughts, real feelings. So the main thing for me in that initial break was to get my ass out of school. Although parenthetically I have to admit that I later on became a teacher. Something then caused us to all converge on Paris. In France, that's where you go. No one had to direct us. It was Trotsky who said the party is always trying to keep up with the masses. Strategy comes from below and tactics from above, not the reverse. And I think that's what happened here. Some trigger or combination of triggers, the extinction of some river dolphin, or another refugee boat going down offshore, who knows, maybe just lost jobs, but suddenly we were all headed to Paris together, often on foot when the highways jammed. Of course, once we got there we couldn't take on the police or the army, that would be suicide. We had to overwhelm them with numbers. And eventually there were so many of us we couldn't be contained. Everything ground to a halt. At that point problems immediately jumped out of the pavement and hit us in the eye. Some were simply logistical, a matter of food and toilets. Others were ideological. The younger we were, the more we wanted. Older people were hoping just to make things a bit better. So the traditional infighting began, but I have to say this was mostly a discursive battle. We weren't like Spain in Franco's time, killing each other or watching the Russians kill us. It was France on its own now, and really we are the country of revolution. Now we had to show what could happen in our time. So we took over the city. Paris was ours by way of sheer bodies jamming the streets. And of course some of us had read about the Commune and realized if we didn't win decisively we would be hunted down and killed, or at best jailed for life. So at that point it was win or die, and we buckled down to making it work as an alternative system of life, a kind of commons that was post-capitalist, even post-money, just people doing what it took to keep everyone fed. And I must say, so many Parisians came out and helped us, cooked food, provided rooms, manned the barricades in every way, that again we had to realize that it wasn't just those of us in the streets, it was all France, maybe even the world. We couldn't tell. But for sure what happened then was the most intense and important feeling I could ever live in this existence. Here's what it was: solidarity. We could see so many others with us, all on each other's side. Paris was a commons, France was a commune. So it felt. Later that proved to be impressionistic to that time, but while it lasted it was amazing. But also exhausting. To live without habits, making it up day by day, trying to get a shower, a meal now and then, find the right way to pitch in, it's much more work than if you're just a wage slave. Much more. But people felt it was important. All over they were dropping what they had been doing and joining the fray and giving it all they had, and it felt right. Somehow we kept finding the ways to give it our all. This we felt was a French thing above all, a kind of political improvisation that our whole history and even our language made us good at, if we could figure it out and pull it off. Help came from weird places. When the internet was killed, the Union of Proofreaders, historically anarchist, which is of course very funny, came out of their tiny niches in the publishing industry and plastered the city with posters on walls, as if the world was still real. And we realized that social media actually meant many things we had forgotten and could be taken back under our own control, at least sometimes. Simply talking was the strongest social media of all, of course. It was obvious once we rediscovered it, but those posters made the city itself our text, as it had been more than once before. But under all that, the right was regathering their forces. And in fact, we didn't have the logistics set up to keep it going forever. We didn't have a good plan to change government itself, and we argued with each other about how to proceed. A movement without leaders is a good idea in theory, but at some point you have to have a plan. How to make one wasn't so clear. State power is a mix, first of the government proper in all its parts, but then also the military, finance, and the population support, and you need all of these working together to make any lasting progress. In our case, supporters in the populace began to complain they couldn't get to their usual bakery, it wasn't open when they got there, and so on. And if there's no plan, if there's nothing that follows the moment of occupation or the moment of the commune, then we're stuck in helplessness and adrift back toward the center. And as someone said, in France the center has neither a left nor a left. So we were in trouble. And so the police waited until after midnight one night and charged us. Pepper spray and men with giant shields, like Roman soldiers in a nightmare. I had a paving stone to throw at them, but at the last moment I couldn't, because the vision of a wounded man came to me, of what it would feel like if that heavy stone in my hand hit me. So I threw it at the ground itself. I was weeping with fury that I couldn't fight properly, and then I joined all the rest who lay down and forced them to drag us off to their vans. They beat us with batons and pepper sprayed us right in the face. The spray was amazingly painful. My whole face convulsed and tears poured out of my eyes and nose and mouth. Even out of the top of my head it felt like. But all through that I kept thinking, fuck it, I don't care. I refuse to care. If they kill me here and now, at least I'll have died for something I believe in. And in the end they just tied our arms behind our backs and dragged us off. There were so many vans. After that it was all over but the shouting, which of course has never subsided. No one agrees on what happened or what it meant. But I know that a lot of what we did mattered, and it was supported at the time by ordinary Parisians, especially the women of the city, They were the real organizers when it came down to it, not the people at the microphones. And now, of course, a lot of us are back in yellow vests talking to people driving by in the roundabouts, and there is a lot of support for what we say. One driver, when the traffic had stopped, leaned out his window and said to me, "Look, it's all about how we treat the land. The revolution will happen there." Another man said, "I don't own my kid's teacher. I don't own my doctor. I don't need to own my house. I just want to pay the collective for it, not some landlord." So maybe someday the solidarity will overcome the splitting. I hope so. During the occupation, I didn't want reform. I wanted something entirely new. Now I'm thinking if we can just get the fundamentals working, it would be good. A start to something better. I don't like to think of this as giving up. It's just being realistic. We have to live. We have to give this place to the kids with the animals still alive and a chance to make a living. That's not so much to ask. Of course, there is always resistance, always a drag on movement toward better things. The dead hand of the past clutches us by way of living people who are too frightened to accept change. So we don't change, and one hard thing now is to go through a time like that, like ours during Paris, 200 days of a different life, a different world, and then live on past that time in the still bourgeoisified state of things, without feeling defeated. For a time, everything seemed possible. You felt free. You feel things so intensely when you're young, and really it's the first time I spoke to the world, the first time I wasn't just the stupid kid in school, but a real person with a real life. Those 7 months made me, and I'll never forget it, never be the same. I only hope to live long enough to see it happen again. Then I'll be happy. Chapter 56. The International Criminal Court was separate from the UN, founded by its own international treaty to prosecute crimes that were somehow outside of nation-state court systems' jurisdiction. It was targeted toward individual crimes and could be effective only when a combination of factors came into an unlikely conjunction. The US and several other big countries had withdrawn from the court's jurisdiction after negative rulings against their citizens. The World Court, more properly named the International Court of Justice, was a UN-sponsored body, so that all member states of the UN were theoretically bound to follow its rulings, but it was designed to adjudicate state-to-state disagreements, and all UN agencies were forbidden to bring cases before it. The Ministry for the Future was an agency created in the implementation meetings of the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement had been brokered under the umbrella of the United Nations, so the ministry was forbidden to bring cases to the World Court. What it came down to was that to prosecute a state, you needed to be a state, and not the UN or an individual. More than that, you had to be a state that had agreed to be within the World Court's jurisdiction. To prosecute an individual outside a national court system, you needed to convince one of the international courts to take your case, and historically this had been hard to do. In short, these two international courts, both located at The Hague, were not well designed as places to litigate climate justice. Tatiana was getting more and more frustrated by this situation. If the ministry had been founded to bring legal standing and therefore lawsuits on behalf of the people of the future and the biosphere itself, fine, she said, fine. But in what court? Tatiana concluded one of her reports to Mary with this. If legal action has to occur in the various national courts, even though the crime is global and committed by those same states whose courts would be asked to judge against them, the actions will not prevail. If we convince a signatory nation to go to the World Trade Organization and file a complaint to the effect that destroying the biosphere contravenes WTO rules against predatory dumping and the like, this is so tenuous and slow as to be useless. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel companies keep pouring vast sums into buying elections, politicians, media, and public opinion. Even when they come to the table to negotiate with us, they never stop these other aggressive actions. Because the best defense is a good offense. This last is true for us as well as for them. Mary read this and ground her teeth. Tatiana was one of her fiercest warriors. They were now at atmospheric CO2 levels of 463 parts per million. The crash in insect numbers put every ecological system on terrestrial Earth in danger of collapse. Collapse, meaning most of the species currently on Earth dead and gone. The surviving species subsequent to this event would be free to spread in all the empty ecological niches, spread and evolve and speciate, so that in 20 million years, maybe less, maybe only 2 million years, a differently constituted array of species would fully reoccupy the biosphere. Mary replied to Tatiana's memo with an instruction: pick the 10 best national cases from our point of view. Do what you can to help them. The inadequacy of this, the futility of it, made her shudder. Hoping to counter this desperate feeling, she convened her NatCat group. Natural catastrophes. It was possibly a contradiction in terms. Maybe the group should be called anthropogenic catastrophes, but anyway, them. Also the infrastructure and ecology groups. She needed to get away from legal abstractions. They spoke enthusiastically of carbon-negative agriculture, clean energy, fleets of sailing ships, fleets of airships, carbon-based materials created from CO2 sucked out of the air and replacing concrete, thus direct air capture of CO2, a necessary component of the drawdown effort, would provide most construction materials going forward. Cheap clean desalination, clean water, 3D printed houses, 3D printed toilets and sewage, universal education, vastly expanded medical schools and medical facilities, landscape restoration, habitat corridors, AG/habitat combinations. Okay, Mary said, chopping short their flood of suggestions. She could see that the people in these divisions were feeling a little neglected. Finance had filled her head for too long. And as Bob Wharton had just said, you could literally fill a medium-sized encyclopedia with the good new projects already invented and waiting to scale. Admitted, there's no end to the good projects we could fund if we had the funds. But what should we be telling national governments to do now? Bob said, set increasingly stringent standards for carbon emissions across the 6 biggest emitting sectors, and pretty soon you're in carbon-negative territory and working your way back to 350. The 6 biggest emitters being industry, transport, land use, buildings, transportation, and cross-sector. Cross-sector? Everything not in the other 5. The great miscellaneous. So those 6 would be enough. Yes. Reduce those 6 in the 10 biggest economies, and you're hitting 85% of all emissions. Get the G20 to do it, and it's essentially everything. And how do you get reductions in those 6 sectors? 11 policies would get it done, they all told her. Carbon pricing, industry efficiency standards, land use policies, industrial process emissions regulations, complementary power sector policies, renewable portfolio standards, building codes and appliance standards, fuel economy standards, better urban transport, vehicle electrification, and feebates, which was to say carbon taxes passed back through to consumers. In essence, laws. Regulatory laws, already written and ready to go. This sounds like a litany, Mary observed. Yes, they told her, it was standard analysis. U.S. Department of Energy and Origin, quite old now, but still holding up well as an analytic rubric. The EU Energy Task Force had done something similar. Really, there were no mysteries here, in either the nature of the problem or the solutions. And yet it's not happening, Mary observed. They regarded her. There is resistance to it happening, they reminded her. Indeed, she said. They were caught in a maze. They were caught in an avalanche, carrying them down past a point from which there would be no clawing back. They were losing. Losing to other people, people who apparently didn't see the stakes involved. She walked down to the park fronting the lake. She sat on her bench and stared at the statue of Ganymede, holding his hand out to the big bird. She watched the white swans beside the tiny marina, circling about, hoping for breadcrumbs. Beautiful creatures. Bodies so white against the black water that they looked like intrusions from another reality. That would explain the way water rolled off them, the way the light burst away from them, or perhaps right out of them. Not creatures of this world at all. It wasn't going to happen from the top. The lawmakers were corrupt. So, if not top down, then bottom up. Like a whirlwind, as some put it. Whirlwinds rose from the ground, although conditions aloft enabled that to happen. People, the multitude. Young people, not just congregating to demonstrate, but changing all their behaviors. Living together in tiny houses, working at green jobs and cooperative ventures, with never the chance of a big financial windfall somehow dropping on them like a lottery win. No unicorns carrying them off to a high fantasy paradise. Occupying the offices of every politician who got elected by taking carbon money and then always voted for the 1%. Riot strike riot. She didn't know if her failure to imagine that bottom-up plan working was her failure or the situation's. Then Badim appeared before her. Mind if I join you? No. Sit. She patted the bench by her. She supposed he had been able to consult her bodyguards to find out where she was. This was a little disturbing, but she was glad to see him. He sat beside her and regarded the view. Who was Ganymede again? He asked, regarding the statue. I think he was one of Zeus's lovers. A gay lover? The ancient Greeks didn't seem to think about things in those terms. I guess not. Didn't Zeus rape most of his lovers? Some of them. Not all. If I recall right. I don't really know. In Ireland, it wasn't a school topic. What about in India? I grew up in Nepal, but no. Greek mythology was not studied. What about Hindu mythology? Don't they have gods behaving badly? Oh yes. I don't know, I never paid it much attention, but the gods and goddesses seemed like a family of, I don't know, distant ancestors. Very heroic and noble, very proud and stupid. It made me wonder what the people were like who told each other these stories in the first place, as if they were interesting stories. Like Bollywood musicals. So melodramatic. I was never interested. What interested you? Machines. I wanted my town to be like the towns in the West, you know. Clean. Easy. Full of shiny buildings and trams. And cable car lifts, for sure. I had to walk 400 meters up and down to get to school and then back home, every day. So, I wanted it to be kind of like Zurich, actually. I wanted to move into the present. I felt like I was caught in a time warp, stuck in the Middle Ages. You could see on the screen shows what the world was like now, but for us it wasn't like that. No toilets, no antibiotics. People died of diarrhea all the time. In general, people were sick. They were worn out. They died young. I wanted to change that. You were lucky to want something. I don't know. Wanting something can make you unhappy. I was not happy. I lashed out. Happiness is overrated. Is anyone ever really happy? Oh, I think so. It looks like it anyway. He gestured around them. Zurich, so solid and handsome. Were the Zurchers happy? Mary wasn't sure. Swiss happiness was expressed by a little lift at the corners of the mouth, by thumping down a stein after a long swallow. Ah, genau. Or by that little frown of displeasure that things were not better than they were. Mary liked the Swiss, their practicality anyway. Undemonstrative, stable, focused on reality. These were stereotypes, sure, and in the part of their lives hidden except to themselves, the Swiss were no doubt as melodramatic as opera stars. Italian soap opera stars, another stereotype of course. Those were all they had once they started thinking about groups. They simplified to an image, and then that image could always be turned to the bad. I'm not so sure, she said. People who have it all, who don't want anything, they're lost. If you want something and your work gets you closer to it, that's the only happiness. The pursuit, he said. Yes. The pursuit of happiness is the happiness. Then we should be happy. Yes, she said unhappily. But only if we get somewhere. If you're pursuing something and you're stuck, really stuck, then that's not a pursuit anymore. That's just being stuck. Badham nodded, regarding the great statue curiously. Mary thought he had come down here to tell her something, surely, but he had not done that. She watched him for a while. Nepal had fallen to a Maoist insurrection that had killed 13,000 people over a period of about 10 years. Some would call that a lot. Others would say it wasn't so many. I notice things happening out there, she said to him. Davos gets seized and the happy rich folk put through a re-education camp. Glamping with Che. Then all those planes going down in one day. We didn't do that, he said quickly. That wasn't us. No. It killed the airline industry, more or less. That was 10% of the carbon burn, gone in a single day. He shook his head, looking surprised she would even think such a thing. I wouldn't do that, Mary. If we had any such violent action in mind, I would confer with you. But really we're not in that kind of business. So, these so-called accidents happening to oil executives? It's a big world, he said. Aha, Mary thought. He was trying not to look uneasy. So, she said, what did you come down here to discuss? Why did you find me and come down here? He looked at her. I do have an idea, he said. I wanted to tell you. Tell me. He looked off at the city for a while. Grey Zurich. I think we need a new religion. She stared at him, surprised. Really? He turned his gaze on her. Well, maybe it's not a new religion. An old religion. Maybe the oldest religion. But back among us, big time. Because I think we need it. People need something bigger than themselves. All these economic plans, always talking about things in terms of money and self-interest, people aren't really like that. They're always acting for other reasons than that. For other people, basically. For religious reasons. Spiritual reasons. Mary shook her head, unsure. She'd got enough of that kind of thing in her childhood. Ireland had not seemed to have benefited from its religion. Badham saw this and wagged a finger at her. It's a huge part of the brain, you know. The temporal lobe pulses like a strobe light when you feel these emotions. Sense of awe, epilepsy, hypergraphia. It's not sounding that good. Mary pointed out. I know. It can go wrong, but it's crucial. It's central to who you are, to how you decide things. So, you're going to invent a new religion. An old one. The oldest one. We're going to bring it back. We need it. And how are you going to do that? Well, let me share some ideas with you. Chapter 57. Next season I was back down there again, helping with the seawater pumping experiment, even though it was obvious to all of us that it was a crazy idea. 10 million wind power turbines? Thousands of pipelines? Not going to happen. It was a fantasy cure. But someone had to try it. And the project had one more season of funding. So we got the pump intake back through the sea ice into the water. Then we followed the pipeline up the big white hill. It was laid right on the ground, because snow or ice was a better insulator than air and warmer too. Still, a big part of the total energy budget was for heating the pipes to keep the water liquid on its way to its destination. The rest of the energy was simply to move the water uphill. And water is heavy, and Antarctica is high. So, whatever. An experiment or an exercise in futility, depending on your view. There were people proposing to generate energy from ocean currents. The Antarctic current runs around the continent like a belt, clockwise as seen from above, and of course it gets channelized through the Drake Passage. If electricity could be generated from that faster section of the current, great. But none of us thought it would work. The sea eats everything you put in it, and the size and number of turbines that could spin up enough electricity to do the job was off the charts. Then there were those who still held the dream of space-based electricity. Russians for the most part. They had used their Molniya orbit for communication satellites for a long time, this being an almost polar orbit, in an elliptical shape that brings it close to Earth twice a day. So the Russians were putting up satellites with solar panels and microwave transmitters to send power down to Earth. Microwave collection stations were to be located by the Antarctic pumps and heating elements, and electricity thus beamed down from space to help power the warmed seawater uphill and inland, even during the long night of the Antarctic winter. Maybe, we said. Although the truth is that solar power from space is not likely to work very well. Capture, transmission, reception, all problematic. Even if a sufficient power supply was found, people would still be required at the upper ends of the pipelines to oversee the water getting poured out up there. So this season we tried that part too, and it was a weird sight to see. Typical polar plateau scene, ice planet zero, a sastrugied white plain to every horizon, domed by a dark blue sky very low overhead, stupendously awesome. You feel like the little prince and have to pinch yourself from time to time. Also do some Pete Townsends to keep your hands warm. It's fucking cold, that goes without saying. And then there's this pipeline like some bad dream from Alaska. Their oil pipeline, I mean, a nightmare. But there it is. When the water pours out of the end of this pipe, it steams madly in the dry polar air and then splashes down onto the ice and runs away, just as we had planned it, having aimed the nozzle down a slight hill. But the tilt of this so-called hill was about 2 meters in every kilometer, as good as we could get in the region. So we got surprised by how fast the water froze. Maybe we shouldn't have been. Most of us had tried the old Antarctic trick of taking a pot of boiling water outside and tossing it into the air to watch it steam and crackle and freeze to ice bits before it hits the ground. It's an experiment that never ceases to amaze. Always good for a laugh. But pouring it out in quantity, as from a fire hose or a sewer outflow, we thought it would take longer. Not so. In fact, newly frozen ice stacked just a few meters from the end of our pipe, creating a low dam that checked the water's progress, making downhill no longer down, so that the unfrozen water began to flow back toward the pipe outlet, and then past it in the other direction. Oh no! We hustled down to the little ice dam and started trying to break it, which worked about as well as you might expect. In the midst of our fuss, as we yelled directions at each other, not desperate but maybe a little panicked, Geordie shouted, "Hey, I'm stuck. Help." He was standing in what had been ankle-deep water near the outlet, which was now ice that had him stuck in place, with more water flowing over his boots all the while. Help. We laughed, we cursed, we tried to cut him out. Nothing worked. He was not in imminent danger, but on the other hand we couldn't free him. And in the race between rising ice and the newly emerged water sliding slickly over it, the ice was winning. It actually takes quite a bit of thermal energy for water to turn into ice. The process actually warms things a little, weird though that seems, but at 30 degrees below zero that warming is a hard thing to detect, or rather it has little to no effect on anything. The frost steaming up from the mess fell on us like Christmas tree flocking, and it began to look like we couldn't get Geordie out without chopping his feet off, which gave me an idea. "Pull him out of his fucking boots," I said. "Leave his boots." This was easier said than done, but luckily he was wearing NSF's white rubber bunny boots, rather than the more tightly fitted mountaineering boots that most of us had on, so we were able to stand by him and give him something to hold on to while we all pulled him up and out of the boots, him cursing as he got his feet up and out in the ridiculously cold air, after which we had to half-carry him to the heated dining hut. Someone had shut off the water quite a bit before, I don't know who. I have to admit it hadn't occurred to me. We were in the midst of an experiment. I don't like to cut those short. Anyway, Geordie's boots are still stuck out there. NSF will not be pleased. They will ding us for it. So Geordie was saved, but the problem remained. Water was going to freeze fast enough to create a problem in getting it to flow across the surface of the ice. The pipe outlet would have to be whipping back and forth like a hose on the driveway with too much pressure in it, which maybe could be arranged, but yikes, how to control that? It's kind of nonlinear. A sharper gradient would help too, Although on the polar plateau those are not easy to find. So we closed down for a week and rebuilt one outlet to emerge under pressure and snake back and forth like a windshield wiper. See how that went. And when we tried it again, water came out of the pipe and flowed downhill and froze along the way and finally pooled pretty well away from the outlet, where it mounded, and the new water shifted and flowed around it and slid down yet again. And we got better and better at mapping where it might ultimately pool and staying out of those pools while it happened. The estimate we came away with was that we could deposit about a meter of water per year on any part of the polar plateau and still have it freeze successfully. More than that, and we would be exceeding the capacity of the air and ice in combination to chill the water. So we would need a wide spreading zone, at a meter thick. That would be about a third of Antarctica. Not going to happen, no way in the world. We had firmly established a trifecta of impossibilities. Not enough energy, not enough pipe, not enough land. So the straight-up seawater pumping solution wasn't going to work. It was a fantasy solution. The beaches of the world were fucked. A lot of us didn't want the beaches of the world to be fucked. As we sat in our little habitats, like mobile homes half filled with insulation, we would gather around the table looking at maps and talking it over. World maps, I mean. The endorheic basins of the world, meaning basins where water does not drain to the sea, were many in number. And many of them in the northern hemisphere were dry playas, where water had existed at the end of the last ice age but dried out since, partially or all the way. The Caspian Sea had been helped to dry down to its current level by people, the Aral Sea even more so. The Darim Basin was completely dry all on its own. Utah's Great Salt Lake was the remnant of a much bigger lake from the past. On and on it went, mostly in Asia and North America and the Sahara. Of course, there were people living in some of these places, but not many of them, given the problems of desertification or disasterated shorelines in the case of the Caspian and Aral. If you added up their volume of empty available space, it was considerable. A lot of seawater could be relocated there, in theory. We ran the numbers. Well, it would do for a meter or two of sea level rise. But then all those basins would be full, and you'd be back to the unworkabilities of Antarctica. No! We needed to go back to the plan to pump water out from under the big glaciers, to drop them back on rock beds to slow them down. Slock had been right all along. It was the only thing that was going to work. We had been following the money, taking it where we could get it, and doing what they asked us to do with it. The billionaires and oil companies and Russia, even the NSF, had said, pump seawater back onto Antarctica? Cool idea. Do it. But we were the glaciologists, so we had to guide the process if it was going to have any chance of success. Give expert advice, guide the money where it needed to go. So, the next Antarctic season we were back. We went every year anyway, of course, but for once this was a really good reason to go. Mostly we just like it down there and are looking for excuses. Science. Is the ice on Antarctica 5 million years old or 50 million years old? Huge argument. That kind of thing. Pure science. This was much more applied. It felt good. This time we went to the Pine Island Glacier above the Wace, the West Antarctic ice sheet. Pine was running narrow and fast into the sea, right next to Pine Island. It had been a study site for many years, so NSF had the logistics in place for getting a camp installed there. Although in fact they weren't experienced in getting as much stuff there as we needed. We needed almost as much as McMurdo itself. Not really, but NSF had decided that if we were going to give this idea another test we had better make it a good test, or we wouldn't know what our results meant. Our first try long ago was now worthless as data, because no one had ever followed up on it to find out why that hole had cut off and gone dry. So we borrowed the ships that resupplied McMurdo at the end of every summer, and a couple of Russian icebreakers, us having been so stupid as to neglect icebreakers for decades and then build only a couple of wimpy ones, really suitable only for the Arctic, where there's practically no ice left anyway. But the Russians love icebreakers, and they sent a couple of their monstrous beasts south to help us bash an open water lane to Pine Island, where we could land stuff and drag it over and up onto the glacier, using the same snow tractors that had been dragging fuel and gear from Mactown to Pole for many years. Without too much in the way of fuck-ups, we were established on the Pine Island Glacier outlet about a month after Windfly had opened Mactown for the season. A very impressive logistical effort. This was my 25th visit to the ice, and while on Pine Island, I was going to break the 6-year mark for living on glaciers, which was not the craziest of ice head records, but respectable. My wife has never been happy about this, but I like glaciers. And here I was again, out on Pine Island, which is really just a bump in the ice, entirely submerged by it, white sastrugi to the horizon in all directions. It has to be admitted that all Antarctic glaciers look much the same. The dry valleys are fantastic, but 98% of the continent is not like them. It's ice on ice, for as far as the eye can see. So, we deployed the equipment to our first borehole site and got to work. It was like dragging a village over the ice, some kind of Baba Yaga thing, the monster tractors pulling trains of 4 or 5 huts in a row behind them from spot to spot. We started between the Hudson Mountains and Pine Island itself. This was a perfect pinch point in the glacier's fall, a place where if we could thump it back down on its bedrock, it would slow for sure. So we circled the wagons and got to work. It's cold in Antarctica, yeah. You forget that back in your university office in Louisiana or Pennsylvania or California or Ohio or wherever you winter over. Even when your home in the world feels colder than Antarctica, like in Boston, you still forget that the Antarctic cold is really a true, deep cold, so cold it burns. Then after a few days in it, you forget about it again. Of course, a wind will remind you, and you don't want to go out poorly dressed, or get frostnipped, or even frostburned, or get to the point where if you flick your cold ear it breaks off and falls to the ground. But for the most part, it's just the way it is. Cold. Keep a good selection of gloves and deploy them as appropriate. Humans evolved in ice ages, and properly dressed are good in the cold. Just deal. So, the ice borers were still as simple as showerheads. Slow but effective. In the old days, we burned a lot of fuel to get the showerheads water hot. Now solar panels helped to power the heaters. The meltwater under the showerheads gets suctioned and pumped out of the hole and reheated and used again, with the excess piped a distance away to freeze somewhere else. To both sides of the Pine Island Glacier are regions of ice moving slowly, so the water could be dumped there. In truth, it was such a small volume that where we dumped it didn't matter. We could have let it go into the ocean. It wouldn't even have registered there. We could almost have drunk it as our drinking water. We also began to make use of the microwave energy beamed down to us from the Russian satellites in their almost polar orbits to power the pumps and the showerheads when the sun went down. Test whether we could make that work, so we could keep the system going year-round. That first experiment had at least taught us this, that you probably wanted to choose a homogeneous block of ice within the flow of the glacier, so that the movement of the glacier wouldn't deform the hole as we drilled it. We had chosen our site partly for that reason. It was a single block that was 40 kilometers long and extended all the way across the glacier. Still 130 kilometers upstream from the ice shelf, and a couple hundred meters above sea level. Perfect. We had done the calculations as to how many drill holes we needed, and how far apart they should be, and so on. It was pretty audacious. Suck enough water from the underside of the glacier for the whole block of ice that we were working on to lose its water cushion and crash back down onto bedrock, hopefully with a mighty squeal and maybe a crashing sound, as of tires breaking on asphalt followed by car hitting wall. Even if that only happened in our heads, it did seem like it was going to be palpable when it happened. Slock's numbers were holding good. Amount of water lubricating the bottoms of Antarctica's glaciers roughly 60 cubic kilometers. Not insignificant, a clear cube of ice about 4 kilometers on a side and the same high, so half as tall as Everest. Yes, a lot of water for humans to pump. But not outside the zone of what we already pump every year. Still, a lot of water to pump, but that's for all of Antarctica. Around the circle of the continent, about 50 glaciers dump the majority of the ice now rushing into the sea, with a few being the major contributors. Starting from McMurdo and running clockwise, you need to stick the Skeleton, the Mulock, the Beardmore, the Carlion, the Bird, the Nimrod, the Lennox, the Ramsay, the Shackleton, the Liv, the Axel Heiberg, the Amundsen, the Scott, the Leverett, the Reedy, the Horlick Ice Stream, the Van der Veen Ice Stream, the Willens Ice Stream, the Cam Ice Stream, the Bin Shadler Ice Stream, the Mackyle Ice Stream, the Eckelmeyer Ice Stream, the Hammond Glacier, the Boyd, the Land, the Hull, the De Vic, the Murphy, the Haynes, the Thwaites, and our Pine Island, then around the peninsula to the Drury, Evans, Rutford, Institute, Mahler, and Foundation ice streams, then the Support Force Glacier, the Blackwell Ice Stream, the Recovery Glacier, the Slesser Glacier, the Bailey Ice Stream, the Stancomb-Wills Glacier, the Vestraumen Glacier, the Judelstraumen, the Enthusiasti, the Borchgrevingsen, the Shirace, the Rainer, the Beaver, the Wilma, the Robert, the Philippi, the Helen, the Roscoe, the Denman, the Other Scott, the Underwood, the Adams, the Vanderford, the Totten, biggest of them all, the Dibble, the Francois, the Mertz, the Ninnis, the Rennick, the Tucker, the Mariner, the Priestley, the Reeves, the David, the Mawson, and the McKay. That's actually 74. So, 60 cubic kilometers sucked out from under 74 glaciers. Okay, not so bad. Especially compared to 3,600 cubic kilometers, right? So we were melting and casing 20 boreholes into Pine Island Glacier. After that, we'd pump up all the water that we could. It didn't seem so bad. In the same realm as wells up in the world, draining fossil water for farms all over the Ogdalilla and other places set atop irreplaceable groundwater resources. Can be done. Solves all problems. All right, it doesn't solve all problems. But let's not get picky. If sea level rises even a meter, all the beaches in the world are gone, and seaports and coastal infrastructures and salt marshes and you name it. And as Hansen and his team pointed out in their 2016 paper, if the rate of rise doubles every 10 years, quickly you are fucked. All the coastal cities of the world devastated. Damage in the quadrillions. If you think you can put a price on it. What's the monetary value of human civilization? Trying to answer that question proves you are a moral and practical idiot. Well, economists make such calculations all the time, but that's their job, and they think it makes sense. In this case, better just to throw up your hands and say civilization is effectively a fiscal infinity, a human infinity. Tacking down the Antarctic glaciers won't completely stop sea level rise, of course. But if we could get the big ones back to 1/10 of their current speed, like the good old days, that would help a lot. Best to do it in Greenland too. The ice there is going even faster, and even though it has only 1/10 the ice of Antarctica, that's still a 7-meter sea level rise, if all of it were to liquefy. So fine, do them too. Greenland is easier. It's basically a stone bathtub with narrow cracks in it. Tack down those suckers falling through the cracks, and you've got a somewhat stabilized sea level, rising at about 1 millimeter a year, meaning 1,000 years before it rises a meter. Enough time to draw down enough CO2 to get back to 350 parts per million. Hell, enough time to start another ice age if you want to. Basically, the sea level rise problem gets solved. Beaches still in existence. So, someone asked tonight in the mess tent, is what we're doing down here geoengineering? Who the hell knows? What's in a word? Call it glacier elevation operations, based on estimates of godawfulness gobsmacking interested nations' goodness. Geobegging. Call it whatever you want, but don't immediately clutch your pearls and declare we can't predict the unintended consequences. We are sure to create backlash effects so bad they overthrow the good we intended, etc. There are some things man was not meant to know, my ass. We are meant to know everything we can find out. So get over that whole wimpy line of objection. And I'll tell you what the unintended side effects of slowing down the glaciers of Antarctica will be. Nothing. Nada. No side effects whatsoever, and the beaches and coastal cities of the world will stay out of the drink. So if this works, and it looks like it will, I think we'll be doing it. Our team is relatively small. The project is expensive, but not that expensive. Like drilling a few wells anywhere else, pumping water anywhere else, plus keeping everything warm, and getting the stuff and people here in the first place. That will be expensive, yes, and dangerous, but a quick calculation of the cost of this operation of ours multiplied by something like 100 or even 1,000, that gets us to $10 billion. Well, probably it will be more expensive than that. Everything is when you actually get into it. But whatever, call it $50 billion. This is such a bargain. So, I've been waking up every morning excited to get out there. Actually, this is always true for me in Antarctica. Jamesways, mobile homes, tents, Mactown. Get up and try to stay warm through breakfast and prep, gear up, out the door and bang. Freezing sunny cold air, like a wallop of vodka and a slap to the face. Eyes streaming from the double whammy. Give a hoot and head to the line of snowmobiles. Get one of them started, off on the track leading to whichever hole I'm working on. The snowmobile roads are flagged, and the flags tell me what the wind is up to that day. If it's windy, then it's going to be cold. That's the law in Antarctica. That's why they're always saying, it's not the cold, it's the wind. Although when it's windless, it's still cold. But with the wind you are going to freeze your butt. The wind just ransacks you. No clothing is enough. You'd have to be in a spacesuit to be shut of it, and even then you'd be cold. Today I made the rounds and found that every hole was working. Pumps pumping, heating elements, keeping the water liquid. The lines from each pump feed into a bigger pipeline, like a piece of the Alaska pipeline lying right on the ice, with repeater heaters every kilometer, and joints where you can get into the line and run a pig if you need to melt an ice clog. The pipeline is running slightly uphill, which I think is an interesting decision, as you could actually just let it run downhill into the ocean. The addition to sea level rise would be so trivial, well below detection level. But people like to be neat. It's a funny place to describe Antarctica. You can't really get it across to people, what it looks like and what it feels like. I think the clean, dry air makes for some optical illusions that add to the feeling that things don't look quite real. Often it's just snow and sky. That is very common. A sky clean of clouds. Around the coast there are clouds sometimes, more often than on the polar plateau, but still. Blue sky, white snow under it. Sometimes smooth snow, sometimes sastrugi. Sastrugi and even completely flat snow look different when you're looking toward the sun and when you're looking away from it. When looking toward it, there's a glare off icy snow, a blaze off snowy snow. Then when looking away from it, the white goes somehow dark, which is a strange thing, maybe due to the polarization of your sunglasses, but very noticeable when you turn around and look sunward again. The contrasts are more than the eye can deal with. If there are clouds, like the fleets of low marine puffballs that float above the ice near the coast, then their shadows on the snow appear black. A flat snow expanse can suddenly look hilly or peppered with black mesas. More contrast than the mind can handle. Now why is this beautiful? I can't say. Maybe a lot of people wouldn't say it is. But I like it. Looks like tomorrow we'll be able to run the final tests and declare the job done. Then, in about a year, we should be able to tell how it's working in terms of slowing this beast down. Maybe 5 years to be safe. Although people will be in a hurry to declare one way or other. But if you're going to be putting billions into it and training a bunch of crews, you'd do better to be sure. Actually, one of the choke points in the supply chain, in terms of getting this done, if they decide to do it, is simply people. It takes a certain expertise. On the other hand, if we're shutting down all the oil operations, as we really ought to do, then that's a lot of people out of work. And the work in question isn't that different. Some of them might even regard this job as easier. Simple stuff, although colder. But if you're working in Saudi Arabia, maybe you like the idea of cold. And if you're working in Alaska, maybe it makes no difference. Yeah, that part will probably work out. We've only got 50 people here now, and you could do it with 30. Almost half of us are here to study the other half, or do science while we have the camp here, in the usual way. Again, scale that up and the number of people is still trivial. We'll have a party tomorrow to celebrate. I'm sorry to report that this is the last entry in this file of Dr. Griffin's laptop. He took a last inspection run on February 6, and on the way back to camp, he took a shortcut that left the snowmobile road, which is clearly flagged. Visibility was good, so no one is sure why he did that. Usually he stuck to the flagged road, just like the rest of us. It's normal practice on glaciers, where crevasses can be covered with old snow and completely invisible. And taking the shortcut wouldn't have saved him much time anyway. So we are all mystified. We were in the dining hut waiting for him, and when about an hour had passed, our mountaineers got worried and went out to check. Another thing we do is usually travel in twos. But Dr. G wasn't always meticulous about that, and since the entire workspace of the project was within sight of camp, none of us were. I mean, you'd go to check on a pump or whatever by yourself, and to your tent by yourself, to the bathroom, and so on. Just normal. So, when the mountaineers couldn't find him in a quick tour of the wells, we sent one crew up the pipeline to see if he had gone to check the spillway and had a snowmobile problem. The rest of us made the circuit looking for snowmobile tracks leaving our road system. It was all we could think to do, since we could literally see the whole surface of the glacier and no sign of him. That in itself was deeply worrying. It was Jeff, one of our mountaineers, who followed a snowmobile track to an unobtrusive hole. He then came back and got Lance, the team's other mountaineer, looking grim. They went out to near it and then stuck in some ice belays and roped up and walked over to look in the hole. We watched from the dining hut, standing around silently. Lance belayed Jeff, who descended into the hole. He disappeared and was gone about, 20 minutes. It seemed longer. Finally, he reappeared and climbed out and stood there, then walked back to Lance. They conferred. Lance put out an arm and held him by the shoulder. They hugged. They looked our way, saw us. Jeff shook his head. We understood it as clearly as if he had said it. Dr. G was dead. That was a bad night. We sat around the dining hall, stunned. Jeff sat by the stove looking grim and distant. Of course, when he got back to us, we asked him what had happened, but he could only say what was obvious. Dr. G had driven off course. His snowmobile had dropped into a hidden crevasse. He went on to say the snowmobile was stuck about 20 feet down and Dr. G's body under it. Jeff didn't say what condition the body was in. He didn't want to inflict that on us, I guess, or didn't want to compromise Dr. G's privacy, I don't know. Sophie and Karen were crying, and we all cried from time to time. Dr. G had given most of us our jobs, and several of us our educations, our careers. He was one of the old iceheads, the ones who keep coming back, the true Antarcticans. Jeff didn't cry, nor did Lance. Lance was concerned about Jeff. He didn't care about Dr. G. Beakers were always doing stupid things and getting killed. That's why every team in Antarctica is required to have mountaineers as part of the group to keep them safe. But you can't lead them around on leashes, and if they break protocol, you can't stop them, even if you insist on protocol at the start of every deployment. Go through the drill with the utmost seriousness, which truthfully many mountaineers are not good at mustering. So Jeff and Lance were grim, but not because they felt responsible. They were going to have to go down in that crevasse the next day and get Dr. G's body into a bag and haul him up to the surface and get the body on a sled and back to camp. A plane from Mactown would be in tomorrow, if the weather allowed. They already knew about it there. Their voices sounded shocked, sympathetic, the usual. We sat around drinking. Damn, we said. Why? We said. Some of us talked about the bathtub graph. People doing dangerous things make mistakes when they're first learning it, and then when they've known it forever. These were the two periods with higher rates of accidents, while the in-between was a stretch of low accidents. So the graph looked like a bathtub. People who fly planes fit that graph really well. Working on glaciers is somewhat the same. That's how scientists talk at times like that. Maybe everybody. Faced with a death, with a friend suddenly disappeared from the world, the mind shies away from the shock of it, the incredulity. Why? Can't we have a do-over? Pop back just a few hours, do it differently? No. So we sat there and drank. Well, Sophie said, at least he died saving the world. No. Jeff said. No. It was a mistake. Even then, he didn't cry, though his face went red and he looked furiously distraught. We huddled in a mass around him and sobbed or didn't. These feelings come on you or they don't. The timing is weird. Lots of people dissociate in moments like that, and it only hits them later. Sometimes so much later you can't believe it. I know this myself. For me, once it was literally 21 years between the death involved and me feeling it. 21 years, I swear. But on this night most of us cried. All but Jeff. We were distraught. After that we pulled ourselves together and cleaned up the place and discussed plans more quietly. Nothing to be done. Finally we gave up and went to bed, reluctantly, as it seemed too normal. It seemed like giving up on any chance of things changing or the world going back in time. Just had to give up and go to bed. We were going to have to deal with a lot of shit the next day. And there was no point in drinking anymore. It wasn't going to do any good. Our leader had made a simple but deadly mistake. The world would go on, but for us it would never be the same. Chapter 58. The usual view of liberation theology locates it in South America in the latter part of the 20th century. The phrase was invented to describe this Latin American phenomenon, so it's fair enough to think that's what it refers to. But in Spain we think there was an earlier example of a young idealistic Catholic priest helping his people in defiance of the church hierarchy. No doubt it has happened many times without anyone noticing it outside the community affected. Of course, the situation with young priests has gone wrong so many times. But maybe more times, the young idealistic man trying to do good in the world, intense, devout, isolated, put out there in a community of poor people, people suffering in so many ways, just trying to make ends meet, to hold it all together, and their church supposed to be part of that effort. When some of these young men get confronted with that situation, in all their belief and their desire to help, their trust in the church, quite a many of them must have fallen in love with their people, and worked furiously their whole lives to do everything they could to serve them. In this particular case in Spain, the young priest was named José María Arizmendiarrieta. Born and raised in the Basque part of Spain, he took arms in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, then got captured by Franco soldiers. It's said that he then had a sort of Dostoevsky moment, in that he was condemned to execution and scheduled to be shot, but in his case was spared by a bureaucratic oversight, as they failed to show up and get him on the day in question. No one knows why. Let's say God had a plan for him. After that, he took holy orders, perhaps feeling his life was meant for something, and he was sent to Mondragon in 1941 when he was 26 years old, as part of an attempt by the Franco regime to pacify the Basque people, who were still rebellious in the aftermath of the Republic's defeat. At first, his congregation was not impressed by him. He had only one eye as a result of the war. He read verses in a monotone. He seemed distant and tentative. One can wonder if he was shell-shocked, or a bit on the spectrum, as we would say now. It took him a few years of quiet listening to his people to come to a determination of how he might help them best. Before the war, the area had supported some light industry, which had not returned. Father Jose Maria wondered if they could start something up again, and as part of that, he helped them to organize a polytechnic school, now known as Mondragon University. Soon after opening, it provided enough engineering support to bootstrap the expertise to begin a few manufacturing businesses again, starting with paraffin burners. And on his suggestion, and with his help, these were organized from the start as employee-owned cooperatives. This mode of organization was in the Basque tradition of regional solidarity, a manifestation of that pre-capitalist, even pre-feudal gift economy of the ancient Basque, which goes back as far as can be determined, into the time before written history. Whatever the explanation, these cooperatives thrived in Mondragon, and a complex of them has been growing there ever since. Eventually, they included the town's banks and credit unions, also its university and insurance company. These worker-owned enterprises became a kind of co-op of co-ops, which now forms the 10th largest corporation in Spain, with assets in the billions of euros and yearly profits in the millions. The profits don't get shifted out as shares to shareholders, but are rather divided three ways, with a third distributed among the employee owners, a third devoted to capital improvements, and a third given to charities chosen by the employees. The wage ratio between management's top salary and the minimum level of pay is set at 3-to-1, or sometimes 5-to-1, or at most 9-to-1. All the businesses and enterprises adhere to the cooperative principles formalized later by the larger worldwide cooperative movement, of which Mondragon is somewhat the jewel in the crown: open admission, democratic organization, the sovereignty of labor, the instrumental and subordinate nature of capital, participatory management, payment solidarity, intercooperation, social transformation, universality, and education. This list is worth studying in some detail, but not here. Taken together, if these principles were to be applied seriously everywhere, they would form a political economy entirely different from capitalism as generally practiced. They make a coherent set of axioms that would lead to a new set of laws, practices, goals, and results. How this has worked out in Mondragon is open to interpretation. The system has been enmeshed in the world economy all along, and it had to make adjustments when the European Union formed, as well as continuous adaptations to the markets and countries it existed in. There are those who say it could not succeed outside of its Basque context, that Basque culture makes it possible. This seems unlikely, but there are many who don't want to consider that an alternative to capitalism, more humane, what you might even call a Catholic political economy, not only is possible, but has existed and thrived for a century, and is still going strong. There have also been moments of crisis, as when recession struck just at the moment that certain critical cooperatives had expanded, or when a manager absconded with an immense amount of money, causing severe cash flow problems. Still, the place makes a good living for its people and creates a culture that is mostly loved by those who perform it. There is solidarity and esprit de corps, and even in a world of intense competition, it makes a profit most years, enough for over 100,000 people to make a living from it and to give back to the general culture. There are other such enclaves around the world, and systems that, while not as distinctive and whole, are yet somewhat like it. They survive, sometimes they thrive. The question is, to put it in the dominant vocabulary of our time, could they scale? Are they a way out, a way forward, a step along that way? We think so. For us, the project is to spread the system throughout Spain. For everyone else, maybe the world. But this is our contribution. We give you Mondragon. Chapter 59. I was in my apartment in Sierra Madre, which is a little town lined by tall palm trees, wedged between Pasadena and Azusa, set right at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, which tower over that part of LA like a brown corrugated wall. Pretty ugly if you ask me. It was kind of a blessing when the smog got so thick you couldn't see it, which could happen even from only 3 miles away. None of the ring of mountains backing LA are good-looking, but they do form quite the wall, as we found out that day. Luckily, I was an active kayaker before I broke my arm, and I still had my kayak. My apartment was a granny flat over a garage, its separate entrance something I valued a lot, as I didn't have to bother my landlord going in and out, and he usually never saw me, and thus never got a chance to scam on me. It was kind of a mercy rental on his part, or so I thought before his intentions became clear, as I couldn't afford Hollywood anymore, no doubt obvious, when I gave him my cliched young aspiring actress currently waitressing shtick. And he let me store my big stuff in his garage below my studio, which was really just a storage shed with a bathroom in it, tacked onto the flat roof of his garage. So when the atmospheric river hit, I was one of the few people in the city with watercraft on hand. It rained hard all that first night. The timing was part of the problem. By the time everyone woke up, things were already bad, and it just went downhill from there. Literally so for the water, and therefore everything else. But it wasn't your ordinary flood, or maybe it was, I don't really know. But in our case, the water came roaring down off the side of the San Gabriels onto us. It was terrifying to see what the dawn revealed that day. The mountains are 10,000 feet high over Sierra Madre, and they were catching all that rain, which was falling as hard as in a hurricane or something, and then it was all rushing down those vertical ravines onto the streets that poked up into the ravines, now all of them whitewater rapids brown with mud, and filled with boulders and shrubs and pieces of all the houses that were coming apart farther up the street. I looked out my front door and saw cars floating down the street on a brown wave about 3 feet high that covered everything. I could see the water was already coming into my landlord's house and rushing hard toward the 210. Everywhere I looked was a big sheet of brown water. I shouted to my landlord, but he had already left without informing me. Very typical. In fact, I couldn't see anyone anywhere except for a family on top of their SUV, getting taken for a sideways ride and looking desperate. I got down my outside stairs and sloshed through brown water to the garage side door. Inside, I found the power had gone out, of course, so it was a struggle to get the big garage door open. I managed to pull it up from the inside, and a slush of water flowed into the garage, a little wave about a foot high. But there was my kayak, and I grabbed it and the paddle off the wall, wriggled into the skirt and got into the kayak and took off into the street. That was a crazy moment, realizing the streets were all flooded and my kayak was the only way for me to get around. So much water, and brown as hot chocolate. And it was still raining cats and dogs too, so it was hard to see very far, and hard to believe what you could see. Later I heard the whole LA basin was flooded, all the way from the Hollywood Hills down to San Clemente, past Irvine where I grew up. Orange County was just as bad as LA, which makes sense given they are the same coastal plain with the same backing mountains. Of course there are some high points here and there on the plain, as everyone found out that day. Palos Verdes sticking up near Long Beach, of course, and a few inland neighborhoods on lines of low hills like Puente Hills and Rose Hill, and back where the freeways meet around San Dimas. But for the most part, LA is just one big coastal plain, and on that day, a big brown lake. In lots of places, the elevated freeways were the only flat surfaces that stuck up out of this new lake. So, with no other place to go, the freeways were where people went. There were still some cars up there, but none of them were moving, and as the need for space to accommodate people got greater, a lot of cars were shoved over the side into the drink. I kayaked under the 210 through a very scary underpass and paddled around getting people off roofs and over to the freeway, where on-ramps served as boat docks. A lot of people were zipping around on motorboats they had kept in their driveways, also some kayaks like mine. We were doing all we could to help. Some people were really desperate, especially if they had kids, and it was hard to keep them from tipping my kayak over in their panic. My arm started to hurt where it had broken, and I kept feeling a sense of unreality that this could all be happening at all. It was too much like a cheesy disaster film, but whatever. I must have gotten cast at last, and besides the fear on people's faces and in their voices kept reminding me that no, this was real no matter how weird it was. And my arm hurt. Kayaking is just very bilateral. You can't do it one-armed, but I just kept saying fuck it and kept paddling. One thing about the LA basin being so huge was that even though the whole thing was flooded, it was never flooded very deep. Lots of taller rooftops stayed above the flood level, although many other buildings had collapsed into the water. Most palm trees were knocked down. It was a shock to see and a danger to navigation. One of many. Sometimes I had people hanging onto the back of my kayak and the current would take us toward a floating tree or a car, and I would have to paddle insanely to get away from them, my arm hurting and the people hanging on and not always kicking in the most helpful ways. And all the old washes crossing the plain were now revealed again as fast places in the flow. It was spooky to see those currents, dangerous too, and it was never obvious which way water would be moving on any given street, because it depended on where the nearest wash was. So the water got sucked toward those, and the streets were almost flat. A whole river network was being revealed or half-revealed by currents in the streets. North, south, east, west, they could be running in any direction. Orange Grove Avenue was on enough of a tilt to be like a water slide running south. Then the old sunken part of the Pasadena freeway just west of it ran in the other direction. It was crazy. Sepulveda was scary fast. I was told. The other kayakers all said stay off Sepulveda. It's like class 8. And the rain kept pounding down on us. Hard rain in LA for hour after hour. It was like Noah's flood. And it looked like it could go on for 40 days and 40 nights too. Why not? So, 10 million people stranded on all the high points left sticking out and no food to speak of. Rain pounding down for hour after hour. Lots of little boats, but nothing big and nothing organized. All the freeways packed with very wet people. It was never colder than about 7 degrees, although that feels cold when you're wet. It's windy, but cold wasn't the issue. Nor was the flood like some do-it-right-now-or-die emergency, where you get an hour of total danger followed by relief. That became clear as it went on. So, not like a movie, not at all. Which was impressing me more and more. Here I was helping people, all of us wet and scared, and my right bicep just screaming, and I kept thinking this is real. This feels good. Why are you trying to be a fucking actress? Oh sure, some people had gotten caught somehow and drowned. It was inevitable given the number of people and the power of water. Water is a force of nature. You can't resist it if it gets you. But for the most part people were on rooftops or on the freeways, and it was more a matter of evacuating everyone before they starved than anything else. If you didn't get drowned right away, then it was just a matter of holding on and waiting for relief. So as the day wore on, I joined a crowd on the roof of a restaurant, and they fed us spaghetti. They had broken through the roof, and were using the restaurant's food supplies and big pots from its kitchen, and cooking over an open fire. A group of men were tending, set on a big sheet of corrugated metal they had pried off of something, with another sheet as a roof over them to keep the rain off. Chances seemed good they would burn that restaurant down, but on the other hand, they could always take their roof sheet away, and the rain would drench any fire that wasn't nuclear. It was still pouring down so. After a while there, my arm felt better, and I went back on the water, fueled up and ready to help more people. There were fewer of them in the later afternoon. People were either dead or had gotten to a high point of some kind. So I joined the other boaters, and we made some street sweeps. It was really fun to ride down Orange Grove Avenue, I have to say, running the brown flow almost as fast as a car, but you had to stay sharp, because sometimes an easy flow would head under a freeway bridge or the like, and it could quickly become desperate getting out of that current before you got sucked down and killed. People shared knowledge of these danger zones. That's how I heard about Sepulveda. No one's phone was working, but some people had GPS devices with maps saved on them, and they were happy to share their orienteering news. And a lot of people out had local knowledge as well. So we paddled around and the motorboats zipped around, often wasting gas without thinking that they weren't going to be able to refill anytime soon. But after a while they remembered, if they didn't run out, and so most of the action as the sun went down was kayakers and a few rowboats and the like, even some sailboats with their sails down and people in them paddling along awkwardly. Little flotillas like human water bugs on the Great Lake of LA. And what was occurring to me over and over again as all this was happening was, hey, I hate LA. I was born here and I know it well, and have even read or been told some of its history in school, and I really do hate it. The truth is, after World War II, this place went from a sleepy little spread of villages to the 10 million people here now, and during that time the developers were getting rich, making ticky-tack suburban neighborhoods, and putting in the freeways, which cut the plain into 100 giant squares, and all of it crap. No plan, nothing good, no parks, no organization, no plan of any kind. Just buy some orange grove and subdivide it and tear out the trees and build a bunch of plywood houses, and then do it again, over and over. It happened in a snap of the fingers, and it was never anything but stupid. And that's what we've been living in ever since. And more than a few of us trying to live out a remake of the movie La La Land. It was double stupid. So, as we were paddling around in our kayaks, people were saying to each other, this whole fucking place is gone. Everything is going to have to be torn out. The entire city of Los Angeles is going to have to be replaced. Which was great. Maybe we could do it right this time. And I myself am going to find a different job. Chapter 60. Spring came and Mary began to swim again from the Utoquai swimbad, first once or twice a week, then every day. Then tram back up to the office. She gave the final nod to Janice Athena's Yorlock, and J.A. posted the website address to the internet, and they watched it go through its unobtrusive birth, a slow week as it turned out, as it was just one spike in the endless interference patterns of discourse. Then people began to share the news that you could transfer everything going on in the rest of your internet life into a single account on Yorlock, which was organized as a co-op owned by its users, after which you had secured your data in a quantum encrypted cage and could use it as a negotiable asset in the global data economy. Agreeing to sell your data or not to data mining operations out there who quickly saw the new lay of the land and began to offer people micropayments for their data. Mainly health information, consumption patterns, and finance. The royalties for being oneself in the world machine were not insignificant, a kind of lifetime annuity, small but useful. And so people began to make the shift, and one day that tipping point arrived where a nonlinear shear occurred, like an earthquake, and suddenly everyone had a Yorlock account and would henceforth be conducting their internet life by way of it. A whole new internet ecology, the much-hyped but previously vaporware-esque Internet 3.0. This was news, of course, remarked on everywhere. But on the other hand, when Mary went down to the lake in the mornings to swim, Everything looked the same, and this was true everywhere. Global revolutions these days were strange, Mary thought, being as virtual as everything else. And, of course, in the virtual world it had indeed caused an uproar. What did it mean? Who owned this new system? It was open source, some said. No one owned it. People working in the gift economy had made it, which meant maybe just people playing around. So who profited from it? Other people said its users were its owners and thus made whatever money it made, mostly, as always, by way of advertising fees. It was somewhat like a credit union, perhaps, inserting itself into the social media discourse space. As with a move from bank to credit union, instead of the company using the consumer used the company and owned it too. What did the company per se get out of it? Nothing, because a company was nothing. It was just an organization devised to help its employee owners, nothing more. Like any other company, in the end. If you thought that was what they were. All this was going over very poorly in China, where the stance had always been that the Chinese Communist Party was precisely a company in that mold, owned by its consumers and only in existence to advance their welfare. So they kept the New York site outside their Great Firewall, as they had so many previous Western internet companies. But the Great Firewall was riddled with holes, and although some argued that most Chinese netizens were completely absorbed and happy in their Chinese space, it did seem to be true that many of them kept links to multiple accounts they had going all over the world. The internal migrants in all the big cities of China, sometimes called the billion, were still an exploited labor force to the point of wanting some outside leverage over the hookah system that had made them illegal for moving to the cities, and the prosperous middle class was always interested to slip some assets offshore. So, in some sectors of the Chinese populace, the site was also being taken up in significant numbers. Days passed, and as far as Mary could tell in Zurich, the impact of all this internet turmoil was minimal on daily life. Possibly it was the global revolution that internet advocates had been calling for since the beginning of the internet, but as no previous manifestation of this poorly defined revolution had ever come to pass, unless one counted the great privatization of the late 1990s, no one could say for sure what it would look like when it happened. Indeed, the internet's earlier rapid colonization and capitalization of the mental life of so many people had occurred in a similarly invisible fashion, so Mary wasn't sure people even knew what they were wishing for when they postulated an internet revolution. But her team knew, or they were imagining it. Now, everyone who signed up for Yourlock and started using it was also helping to sustain it, by hosting their part of a blockchain record of its history from its beginning. A distributed ledger, it was only by way of work given for free, meaning not just the labor but the electricity, by many millions of people, that this new organization could function at the level of the computing required. Even if that worked, Mary wasn't sure it was going to represent a net gain in terms of a sustainable civilization. Probably it would depend on what this new network was used for, or on what people did in the physical world. As always, the decisive moves were still to come. Possibly it was true that they would happen first in the realm of discourse, then afterward in the realm of material existence. She tried to focus on that latter part of life. Morning swim in the Zurich Sea, its temperature creeping up as spring turned to summer. Tram and trudge to work. Trudge home. Take a weekly tram ride down into the city center and the Gefängnis to visit Frank May. This was some kind of duty. He seemed to be doing all right. The Swiss prison system was typically Swiss, practical, benign, a kind of community college dorm that you couldn't opt out of. Frank spent his days out around the city doing public work of various kinds, from street cleaning to nursing assistant, depending on the need and that month's schedule. He was either calmer and happier than on the night they had met, or else subdued and depressed. Mary didn't know him well enough to be able to tell. Possibly a bit of both, if that was possible. Other people, if they didn't want to share with you, you had no way to tell. When she visited, He regarded her curiously, not surprised anymore that she was showing up, just perhaps a bit discomfited or mystified. But not enough to ask her why she came. If he had, she wouldn't have been able to answer him very well. In her head, she staged conversations with him that were completely unlike what really happened when they were together. Tramming back up the Zuriberg, she would watch the other blue cars of the tram, bending ahead and behind in the switchbacking S-turns that the tracks made to get up the slope, saying to the Frank in her mind, "If you would just ask me, I would say to you, I visit you because I want to rest easier, because I am helping you to rest easier." My conception of the world going well is a world in which even you look at it and feel it possible to rest easier. A world in which you gave yourself a break and forgave all the rest of us our sins and forgave yourself too. And in these mental conversations, he would often nod and say, "Yes, Mary, I feel better about things. Your stupid ministry has put its shoulder to the wheel and helped to shove the cart out of the ditch. Although it's not out yet, not by a long shot, because the ditch was eating the road." Nothing remotely like that ever passed between them in their actual meetings. She kept track of Badham's informal work in private meetings away from the office, in the pattern they had established. They didn't meet often, nor was there any way to communicate in the office that wasn't subject to surveillance, so pretty often it was a matter of handwritten notes left on her desk, never direct messages, but rather lines attributed to Rumi or Kabir or Krishnamurti or Tagore. She didn't know these poets' work, and wasn't sure if the quotes were real or made up. The gods are in disarray. It is the theory which decides what one can observe. A great comet will appear in the sky tomorrow. Look to windward. These phrases, as gnomic as Nostradamus, were only meant to tell her that things were happening. It was time to meet again. Or so she assumed. If there were specific messages encoded in them, she wasn't getting them. So she kept reading the news. 2 days after a note had appeared on her desk that said only riot strike riot, she read that Berlin, London, New York, Tokyo, Beijing, and Moscow had experienced simultaneously, in the very same hour no matter the local time of day, teacher and transport worker strikes. This caused chaos in the streets and in the markets. Already the past year's chaos had been sufficient to cause a massive drop in most of the stock markets, and they had never really recovered from crash day, so that was low indeed. The bear of bears. Of course the slack was soon enough taken up by risk seekers looking to buy low and sell high later, but the sense of panic didn't go away, the sense that bubbles were about to burst all over the place. The striking workers in the big cities returned to work, but before the situation had settled, the seemingly endless drought afflicting the Middle East, Iran, and Pakistan suddenly intensified into another killer heat wave, this though it was still only May. But the high pressure that sat on the area had jacked temperatures briefly up into the wet bulb 35 zone, mainly this time a matter of sheer high temperature rather than humidity, and at the same time some cities there were running out of water. Refugees from the area were pouring across Turkey into the Balkans, also north into Armenia and Georgia and Ukraine and Russia, also east into India. India, a refuge from heat waves. But the Punjab was also caught in a drought, so India had sealed its border with Pakistan, already militarized and easy to close. Disaster all around. Pakistan threatened war. Iran threatened war. Something like 10 million people were on the move and in imminent danger of dying. The humanitarian aid programs were overwhelmed, as were the national militaries. Esmeri Zayed, her refugee division head, told her that if the current refugee population were a country, it would have about the same population as France or Germany. 100 million people were out there wandering the earth or confined in camps, displaced from their homes. In the midst of this situation, an atmospheric river struck Southern California, and though its winds were not as forceful as the winds of cyclones or hurricanes, its rainfall was at least as intense and longer lasting. It looked like it might be something like a a repeat of the catastrophic winter that had struck California in 1861 to 62, arriving several hundred years earlier than would have been expected by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as they had labeled the earlier storm a thousand-year storm, but of course all those probabilities were useless now. The tall mountains hemming in the LA basin had caught the truly torrential rain and poured it down onto the mostly paved surface of the basin, and the devastation was universal. Initial estimates pegged the death count to a remarkable low of 7,000 or so, but the infrastructure damage dwarfed anything the Angelenos' much-feared earthquake would have done to them. Actually, there were scientists warning that the weight of that much water might trigger that very earthquake. The big one, right in the middle of a megastorm. Only in LA, people said, feeling shivers of schadenfreude tinged with regret, the world's dream factory was being destroyed before their eyes. No more Hollywood faces to haunt the global unconscious. That age was over. Restoration costs for the damage they were seeing on the raindrop-spattered images would cost more than $30 trillion, Yugen estimated. So now one could imagine that the American people might support action on the climate change front. Better late than never. But no. Already it was becoming clear that LA was not popular in Texas, or on the East Coast, or even in San Francisco for that matter. In fact, no place that was not LA cared about it at all. The dream factory for the world, universally unpopular. People had not liked those dreams, perhaps. Or had not liked having their dream life colonized. Or maybe they just didn't like being stuck in traffic. In any case, California's government, one of the most progressive in the world, and the U.S. federal government, one of the most reactionary in the world, both were making efforts to help. Love it or hate it, LA was important to them. And really, Mary thought, keeping the death count down to 7,000 was an amazing accomplishment of civil engineering and citizen action, also rapid deployment by the U.S. Navy and the rest of the military, and the quick actions of the citizens themselves. The initial rush of the flood had been the most fatal part of it, and after that it was just an accumulation of small accidents. So it was an admirable emergency response. Really, the U.S. was in many respects the gold standard for infrastructure, a brick house in a world of straw. Those stupid raised freeways, built strong enough to withstand the big one, had served as refugia for the entire population of the city, and the subsequent evacuation had proceeded successfully. A very impressive improvisation. Despite LA's uneven popularity across the world, it was for sure immensely famous. The Dream Factory had accomplished that at least. Many people all over the world felt they knew the place, and were transfixed by the images of it suddenly inundated. If it could happen to LA, rich as it was, dreamy as it was, it could happen anywhere. Was that right? Maybe not, but it felt that way. Some deep flip in the global unconscious was making people queasy. Despite this sense that the world was falling apart, or maybe because of it, demonstrations in the capitals of the world intensified. Actually, these seemed to be occupations rather than demonstrations, because they didn't end but rather persisted as disruptions of the ordinary business of the capitals. Within the occupied spaces, people were setting up and performing alternative lifeways with gift supplies of food and impromptu shelter and toilet facilities, all provided or enacted by the participants as if in some kind of game or theater piece, designed mainly to allow unceasing discourse demanding the official governments respond to the needs of their people rather than to the needs of global capital. And the governments involved had to face either sicking their police and militaries on their own people, or waiting out the occupations for what could be months, or actually changing in the ways demanded. Time to dismiss the people and elect another one, as Brecht had so trenchantly phrased it. Meanwhile, flying was still much reduced, except for an increase in battery-powered short flights and an immense surge in airship construction. Ocean trade was disrupted, millions were out of work, millions were in the streets. Online, people were joining Eurolock and abandoning the other social media sites, now called the predatory social media. So many people were withdrawing their savings from private banks and depositing them in credit unions and alternative cooperative financial institutions that another financial crash not only was happening but was the deepest in over a century. The banks had all been so over-leveraged for so long that what that actually meant had been lost. So now, in a crisis as big as this one, most of them had been brought to their knees and were stumping to their government's central banks to squeal for salvation. This time the government's treasuries, although still in the hands of financial industry veterans, found they could do nothing like what they had done in the 2008 bailout. That crash was looking minor compared to this one, and because of the 2020 recession, awareness of what was happening and why was much higher. It was a different time, a new structure of feeling, a new material situation. Already people were saying this was bigger than 2020, bigger than the Great Depression, maybe the biggest economic crash ever, because it wasn't just economic. The whole damn merry-go-round had spun off its flywheel and was disintegrating as it fell. So Mary called up the heads of the various central banks around the world and got them to agree to gather to talk things over yet again. Many of them wanted her to come to them, and she almost agreed to hold the meeting in Beijing. The Chinese would be key to any solution. But the Chinese were punctilious about joining international meetings and would go anywhere the meeting was held. She judged they didn't care so much about national prestige that they would refuse to join a settlement being worked out elsewhere. The puffy nation in that regard would be the United States, but Mary was pretty sure Jane Yablonsky would also come to the meeting wherever it was. And the Bank for International Settlements annual meeting in Basel was coming up soon anyway. So she told them to please come to Zurich too, right after the BIS meeting. Air travel being now so fraught, specially arranged stealth military flights would bring them all to Switzerland, or now, quite a few would fly in on airships. Hosting a meeting of a dozen or 20 of the most powerful people on Earth, which meant also accommodating large staffs for each of them, was a big job, but one that the Swiss were used to performing. For this meeting there were too many people for the ministry offices to hold, so they held the meeting in the Kongresshalle, down by the lake. The morning they convened, the broad picture windows spanning the south wall of the big room provided them with the pathetic fallacy in full measure. A spring storm lashed the Zurich Sea, with low shifting gray clouds dropping black brooms of rain onto the silvery lake surface, the windows running wild with deltas of rainwater kaleidoscoping this view. Nothing unusual in that, no LA-like climate apocalypse here, just Zurich spring weather as usual, but still very fitting, given the mood in the room, which was one of grim virtue. They would weather this storm, they said to each other while looking out at it, and all the stark emotion in the room was heightened by the dark metallic sublimity of the rain-lashed white caps on the lake, the sound of the wind ripping through the flailing trees. Mary brought them to order. She reminded them of the meetings she had had with them over the past few years, in which she had urged them to create a new currency of their own collaboration, based on carbon sequestration and exchangeable on currency exchanges, money like other money, but backed by the central banks working together and securitized by the creation of really long-term bonds. Bonds with a century payout at a guaranteed rate of return large enough to tempt anyone interested in fiscal stability. In essence, as she had been saying, creating a way to invest in survival, to go long on civilization, as opposed to the many ingenious ways that finance had found to short civilization, thus in the process shifting most of the surplus value created in the last 4 decades to the richest 2% of the population, making those few so rich that they could imagine surviving the crash of civilization, they and their descendants living on into some poorly imagined gated community post-apocalypse in which servants and food and fuel and games would still be available to them. No way, she said to the bankers, not a chance that would happen. Shorting civilization and imagining living on in some fortress island of the mind was another fantasy of escape, one of many that rich people entertained, as ridiculous as retreating to Mars. Money was worthless if there was no civilization to back it, no civilization to make things to buy, things like food. So even if the central bankers were regarding their task in the very narrowest terms, as stabilizing prices and helping the employment rate, and more than anything else, preserving the perceived value of money itself. To do that now, they had to leave their usual monetarist silos and regard themselves as what they were, the not-so-secret government of the world. In that capacity, something more was now called for than merely adjusting their fucking interest rates. Yes, they were shocked by her bluntness, by her disgust for their timidity. These Irish. They were thinking. She could see that. But they were also paying very close attention to her. They were transfixed, the storm outside forgotten. Now the storm was in the room, in the form of one angry, intense, middle-aged woman. Well, she had to remember, when a meeting got hot it was usually going badly. This was a calculated risk, getting their attention by lashing them a bit. Now she had to calm it down. So she did that. The last time she had asked them to do this, she reminded them, they had refused her. Now, she told them, the situation was different. It was so much worse it could scarcely be believed. And as the current representative in their midst of all the future generations to come, she was going to have to insist that they act. She was, remembering what Dick had told her about letting them invent the instruments, open to their suggestions as to how best to act. Possibly the Bank for International Settlements could be brought out of its 20th century time capsule and used as the instrument at hand for this. But act they must, because civilization was trembling on the brink. They were going down. Here the pathetic fallacy of an ordinary Zurcher spring storm helped bring her point home. The wind was really howling now. The air was black, though it was just before noon. The whole lake was slamming into the windows and blurring the view, then the wind clarifying it with a blast, time after time. It was almost as rainy as Galway. The new Chinese Minister of Finance, who served as the head of their central bank and was also at the same time a member of the Standing Committee, and thus one of the 7 most powerful people in China, stood up to speak. A woman who had learned her English at Oxford, it sounded like, and she had a cheerful, relaxed manner, as if they were discussing history, which Mary supposed they were. She pointed out that Mary had not visited China in her tour of the central banks, nor had she herself been finance minister at that time, so she had not been part of the earlier unenthusiastic response Mary had just described. In fact, in China the national banks were always trying to throw their weight around as vigorously as they could to help China's economy, and they would be happy to join any international effort that they felt could help in a way that was good for China and the world. Indeed, it sounded to her as if what Mary was asking for was precisely the kind of thing that the Chinese government did all the time. True enough to be a discussion point, Mary replied. But no matter which national or supranational, with a nod to the European Union's central bank head and the BIS head, model they referenced or preferred, now she urged them to consider again something new and fully international, a carbon coin, a digital currency backed by a consortium of all the big central banks, with open access for more central banks to join. These coins to be backed by long-term bonds created by the consortium and shored up against financial attacks by speculators who were sure to attack it. Defended by all the central banks working together, they would be able to repulse successfully any entities that tried to hamstring their new system. Indeed, if the central bank's blockchain, not just the new carbon coins but all the fiat money that existed, they could probably squeeze parasitic speculators right out of existence. The best defense being a good offense. The crucial banks, Mary thought privately, were the US, the ECB, and China. Germany and the UK were also important, also Switzerland itself. The more the merrier, of course, as always. but the big three were crucial. Even if it were just those three, they could probably go it alone, although if they were in, Mary was sure others would join. So, right now, although the new Chinese finance minister thought she was being positive by cheerfully comparing the proposal to ordinary Chinese practice, this wasn't actually helping much with the others. They were looking skeptical that becoming more like China was really the answer for this moment. China was debt-laden, opaque, oligarchic, authoritarian. Even granted the modifying Chinese characteristics always referenced, they were avowedly socialist, even Marxist. What that really meant no one knew, not even the Chinese, but their financial practices were constantly offending ordinary Western norms and sensibilities, so it hadn't been a very diplomatic move on the part of the Chinese finance minister to suggest to them that by necessity they were now having to become more Chinese. But looking at her, Mary didn't think that this new finance minister was really very regretful about that. Her look was amused, but in the way a hawk might be amused, something hard to imagine. She had a fierce edge. On the other hand, all central banks were undemocratic technocracies, not that dissimilar to China's top-down system. They were run by financial elites who did what they felt was best without consulting even their own legislatures, much less the citizens of their countries. As institutions, they were in fact specifically designed to function outside any legislative or democratic whims, the better to keep the financial ship of the world steadily sailing on into the great west of universal prosperity, for the elites first, and everyone else if they could be accommodated without endangering the elites on the first-class deck. So an invitation to become more undemocratic, if couched diplomatically enough, would not be entirely unwelcome to this crowd. It would be a matter of how one phrased it. Phrasing was also important when showing the stick. First the carrot, which she felt was the best way to lead. Do it, she told them, and you are the saviors of the world, staving off chaos and allowing the huge resources of humanity and the earth to be brought to bear on the greatest crisis in history. People would be writing about them, analyzing them and copying them, even celebrating them, for centuries to come, and a model would be built by them here and now which could be adapted to deal with any future crises of similar dimensions. Thus the carrot. The stick. If they didn't do it, Mary and her team could arrange the whole thing to happen through Yorlock accounts as a distributed ledger coin, created and given by people to each other. This would cut hard into any power central banks might be said to have. Then also, the Ministry for the Future had allies within every relevant legislature, and Mary's legal team had prepared detailed advice for governments to introduce new legislation that would expand legislative control over the central banks, giving them mandates and responsibilities to mitigate climate change proactively, as opposed to just responding to the financial risks reactively. The new mandates would require central banks to create a digital currency and manage the exchange rate of it, using all the mechanisms at their disposal. In short, Mary was prepared to start a movement worldwide in which governments put their central banks on leashes and directed them to act in ways governments wanted. The great example of how effective this nationalization or internationalization of the national banks could be was the takeover of the Bank of England by the British Treasury during the Second World War. Britain had commandeered the Bank of England to properly guide capital where it was needed to win the war. The same could be done again with climate change, if the relevant legislatures felt it was necessary. Country-appropriate laws were ready to be introduced by sympathetic, powerful politicians in every country. That's what we'll do if we have to, she concluded. She was being blunt again, as at the start. She was slipping into that certain Irish rhetorical mode that was so often useful, the one that said no more fucking around. Reality has struck, said with blunt disdain for any naivete or cowardice that refused to admit the obvious facts. That mode was a mode she liked. But of course, she went on silkily, I don't think a total takeover of central banks by governments, or replacement by a new people's currency, will be necessary. Sharing for a moment a single basilisk glare with the Chinese minister, who clearly was enjoying her presentation. Renminbi was Chinese for people's money, after all. The situation we're facing is unprecedented, she went on, and its causes are clear, and now we have to act, and so we will. Are the causes so clear? Asked Jane Yablonsky sharply. I'm not so sure. Mary let Badham and the rest of her team make the case. She had asked them to prepare a kind of group presentation that ran around the table in cause/effect mode, describing each aspect of the problem in turn. Of course, the causal chains ran in all kinds of directions. It was a cat's cradle, but she could make that point at the end. For now, 3 minutes each to describe the problem: climate change caused by carbon dioxide and methane released to the atmosphere, knock-on effects very close to releasing vastly larger quantities of CO2 and methane, now cached in the Arctic permafrost and the ocean's continental shelves. Oceans unable to uptake more CO2 and heat, rate of extinctions already as high as, at any time in Earth's history, in terms of actual speed of extinctions per century, thus set now to match the Permian in terms of total percentage of species gone from the land, which was 90%. Subsequent to that coming extinction, inevitable famine, dislocation, and war, possibly nuclear war, leading to the destruction of civilization, impossibility of ensuring against such an eventuality, or clawing back from it, irreversible and unfixable catastrophe. Thus, ultimately, as a result of all these converging factors, Mary concluded at the end of her team's presentations, they were facing the impossibility of stabilizing inflation rates and employment rates as the climate heated up. The specific principal tasks that central banks were charged with could no longer be fulfilled if the climate emergency got out of hand. In other words, central banks would fail in their principal tasks if they did not save the civilization that had charged them with those tasks. And although it was true that full employment would always remain a key objective for them, she finished, it wasn't such a victory if the remnant of humanity that survived the crash ended up working as scavengers and peasant farmers. That wasn't the kind of full employment that the world had in mind when central banks were created. She saw that Yablonsky and the Europeans were offended at this final sarcasm, and she pondered for a moment, simply shouting suddenly in their faces, or taking her shoe off and pounding the table Khrushchev style, or throwing a chair through the picture window and letting the storm pour in over them. Sudden fury at their mulishness. Fuck your inflation rates. She wanted to shout. Do the job that only you can do. And judging by their faces, it was possible that her own face held all these sentiments and imagined actions and curses, perfectly visible in the way she was looking at them. The power of the eye. Not Medusa, turning them to stone or killing them with a strike from a snake on her head. Instead, she fervently hoped, some kind of electrical jumpstart, applied by jumper cables that had her 2 eyes as the contact grips, leaping the gap from mind to mind. Yes, she was very close to losing it. Then she saw that the Chinese finance minister was grinning broadly, not even trying to hide it. She checked her cheat sheet. Who was this woman again? Madame Chan, daughter of a finance minister from the generation before. A child of the party hierarchy, like she had been, and so many others. Mary liked her look. In the following days, the representatives of the central banks kept meeting in the same room, and while the Zurichsee provided emotional guidance by way of a succession of brilliantly sunny days, marked by tall clouds like galleons, sailing over the lake as if carrying vast treasure, the central bankers finally invented a proposal they could all agree on. It was as bold as anyone could want, and Mary felt that none of the central bankers there would have touched the plan with a 10-foot pole if all of them weren't in it together to take the heat sure to follow. They would issue together a single new currency, coordinated through the BIS, 1 coin per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered from the atmosphere, either by not burning what would have been burned in the ordinary course of things, or by pulling it back out of the air. They promised to establish a floor in the value of this carbon coin, which exposed them to great danger from speculators trying to scare money out of the plan, and they foretold a rise in the value of the currency over the coming decades. By doing these things, they made this investment a sure thing, assuming civilization itself survived. That by itself would guarantee a certain large amount of capital from many different sources looking for just such a sure thing. Pension funds, small national reserves, big corporate assets. Really, anyone responsible would want the security involved, especially now that there was no security anywhere else. In essence, it was like throwing a life ring to drowning people. It could overwhelm the system, actually, if everyone grabbed at once. But carbon had to be sequestered to create the coins in the first place, so if there was a mad rush to do that, it wouldn't be a bad thing. And the central banks could always adjust upward the amount of carbon saved that would be required to earn a coin, creating derivative complications of all kinds and giving them more control knobs. Getting the certification teams for the sequestrations up and running was going to be a crazy effort. In fact, at the end of the agreement, they all lent some fiat money of the ordinary kind, pooled into a fund administered through the BS, which would be enough to pay for this new bureaucracy of verification that would have to be created to certify that carbon was really being sequestered. This was a bureaucracy so vast no single bank could afford it, nor of course the ministry, not even close. It was almost a full employment plan all by itself. So, it was a total program. Mary's team wrote it up in detail, in consultation with the bankers on hand and their staffs, taking all their suggestions and folding them in, and then in the end, after each bank had consulted with its government back home, they announced it and offered the first tranche of carbon coins for purchase. Began to disperse them too, and the trade price for them held. Even rose a little. Then nothing happened. This, Mary thought as the days and weeks after the meeting passed, was beginning to look like a pattern. They were only really doing things to try to ameliorate the situation they were falling into after it was too late for those things to succeed. They kept closing the barn door after the horses were out, or after the barn had burned down. At that point, their actions, which a few years or decades earlier might have been quite effective, weren't enough. Maybe even close to useless. Over and again, it was a case of too little too late, with nothing stronger anyone could think of to apply to the worsening situation. If this were really true for something physical, like the Arctic's permafrost melt, or the ocean's acidification past the point of life at the bottom of the food chain surviving it, or the Antarctic's ice sheet collapsing fast, then they were fucked and no denying it. And yet there were still people fighting tooth and claw. And it could be that it was only in the realm of the social that they were so far behind the curve of the moment. Anyway, people were fighting. Although not just for the good, but also against the good, fighting tooth and claw to forestall their efforts, to hamstring them. Thus, in effect, there were people trying to kill every living thing on Earth in some awful genocidal murder-suicide. Here they were, walking a tightrope over the abyss, and these fuckers were jumping all over the balancing pole they were holding, doing their best to cast them all down to disaster and death. There will always be idiots, Badham intoned as Mary cursed another manifestation of these people. But it was worse than that. There will always be assholes, she said viciously. Badham said, focus on all the people still fighting for the good. There are many more of them than the other kind. Then 1 month after the carbon coin announcement, a bomb went off in their offices on Hochstrasse. It happened at night, with no one in the building. Perhaps that had been the bomber's intent, but there was no way to tell. The Swiss police who accompanied Mary to see the wreckage were taut with apprehension, and they were not so much apologetic as they guarded her, as stolidly disapproving. blaming the victim being one of the errors that law enforcement people were so often prone to. They advised her to accept more police protection. In fact, they insisted on it. And it was true that the sight of their offices, solid stone Swiss buildings, built to last 1,000 years, blown open, shattered, their interiors visible from the street, a black shambles that would have killed them all had they been inside, was indeed shocking to her. So she agreed. It turned out that what they had in mind was not like being arrested and let out for the day with protection. No, her guardians were suggesting or requiring that she go into hiding. They had facilities to make that work for her, safe houses not far away, fastnesses in the Alps, or anywhere in the world she liked. But she needed to hide for a while. Threats on her life were very much in play. They insisted. She got to choose the where, a little, but not the how. If she left Switzerland, she would be leaving her team. And Zurich. So she chose the Alps.